Picture this, a courtroom, empty except for the ghosts of history and the sharp staccato of air caught in tension, weighs down on the room. In a place built to uphold justice, it's silence that holds the most power. Now imagine the heavy sound of a slap, so loud, so violent, that it cuts through that silence like a blade through tissue, and the entire room feels its echo. But this isn't just any slap. It's one directed at a lick-year-old man, his skin darkened by years of the unforgiving sun, his face worn not by age but by a life, lived in a world that sees him as less than human. And the slap doesn't come from a stranger, from a faceless antagonist. No, it comes from a man dressed in the uniform of authority, a cop, an officer of the law, someone entrusted with the power to protect and serve, but instead wielding it as a weapon. Have you ever wondered what happens when the man who holds the power to protect chooses, instead, to abuse it? What happens when the symbol of authority stops representing justice and instead becomes a tool of humiliation? In that courtroom, all eyes are fixed on Luther Rowe, an elderly black man whose years on this earth had granted him more wisdom than anyone could count. A man whose pride was not in his anger, but in his dignity. The slap that struck him wasn't just an act of violence, it was a reminder that some people, no matter their age, no matter their station, are still considered lesser. A reminder that systems designed to protect often favor the ones who least deserve it. But it wasn't just Luther's blood that would spill across the courtroom floor that day. Behind him, standing in the back, silent and unbroken, was his son, Marcus Rowe, a man who had learned to walk through this world with the calm precision of a blade. Marcus was an agent of the FBI, trained to see what others overlooked, to process truth as if it were a delicate equation, and to bring it to the surface, no matter the cost. And what happens when a system designed to shield the guilty cracks open under the pressure of one man's pursuit of justice? What happens when the dad of the man who was slapped, the son of a black man who had seen every form of oppression, walks into the courtroom, not with anger, not with fury, but with something far more dangerous, the truth? As the courtroom continued its eerie silence, the slap hung in the air. The officer, Brent Rollins, who had struck Luther without hesitation, believed himself unscathed, his face twisted into a sneer, wiping his hand on his uniform, satisfied in the belief that this was just another victory in a world where his badge meant he could do whatever he pleased. But what he didn't see, what no one in that room saw, was the long shadow cast over the entire courtroom by Marcus Rowe, standing at the back like an unwelcome force of nature. The moment of violence had passed, but something far more potent had just begun to take shape. Because, you see, there are moments in life, rare, fleeting, almost sacred, when a man doesn't speak. He doesn't shout, he doesn't storm the stage. Instead, he walks away. He walks away knowing that the power to exact change is not in the noise, not in the spectacle. It is in the quiet, unrelenting resolve to make the system answer for itself. Marcus Rowe didn't flinch when he saw his father, his strong, unwavering father, take that slap. He didn't raise his voice, didn't storm up to confront the officer, he didn't scream for justice. He simply stood there, watched, and walked out of the courtroom as if the weight of what had happened could only be processed through a silent, deliberate act. It wasn't the slap that ignited the fire inside Marcus. It wasn't the officer's disregard or his smugness. It was the fact that he had already seen this story before. He had seen it in the eyes of his father when he had stood tall after every assault, after every act. Luther Rowe was no stranger to the violence of the world. He had endured it for decades, from the days when his own father had been lynched by men who wore the same uniform as Brent Rollins, to the countless hours spent with bloodied knuckles from fighting systems that would never acknowledge his worth. Marcus, however, was not his father. He had learned early on that to fight with your fists was to let the world control your pace. To fight with your voice was to lose the fight before it even began. The only fight that mattered was the one where you forced the system to listen. And Marcus had the means to do just that. You know that feeling, don't you? The feeling when you've been pushed so far, when you've seen the system favor the wrong people for so long, that you start to believe change is a thing of myth, something you only hear about in stories. But then something happens. Someone stands up, someone stands tall, and for a moment, just a moment, the system cracks. And as Marcus Rowe walked away from the courtroom that day, leaving the slap, the blood, and the officer's arrogance behind, he knew that the fight was no longer about retaliation. It was about something deeper. It was about correcting a wrong that had stood unchallenged for too long. Because that's the power of one person's resolve. When Marcus Rowe looked at his father, whose dignity could not be broken by a slap, he understood something that others never would. The only true weapon against oppression is resilience. And resilience, when backed by a burning sense of purpose, becomes more powerful than any weapon forged by man. Marcus knew that it was time for the world to witness the weapon he had forged in silence. His mind was already working, piecing together the evidence, preparing the case, sharpening the tools of truth. Brent Rollins, who thought he was untouchable, would soon learn that justice was coming, not with fire, not with fury, but with the precision of a blade. The system, for all its corruption, would not break that day, but it would bend. It would bend under the weight of the truth, and it would break for the first time when Marcus Rowe finally forced it to face what it had tried so long to hide. The world outside the courtroom, the world beyond the fragile walls of bureaucracy and law, moved with the slow, unhurried rhythm of something that had long forgotten how to change. For those who walked through life unaware, it was just another day. The sun, indifferent to the pains of men, continued its climb across the sky, casting its light on buildings that had once been symbols of progress, but now stood as monuments to complacency. Outside, life went on. The buses rolled down the streets, children played in their yards, and news anchors spoke of the next tragedy, the next celebrity scandal, as if it were a piece of entertainment. But Marcus Rowe knew the truth. He knew that the stage was set, not in the courtroom, not in the headlines, but in the stillness of the spaces between. The cracks in the system were no longer something whispered about. They were becoming visible, undeniable. And the man who had believed he could get away with it all, Officer Brent Rollins, had just made the fatal mistake of thinking that his badge was enough to protect him. As Marcus drove back to his apartment, the city around him seemed as distant as a dream. The noise and movement all just background static. He wasn't thinking about the day's events or the chaos that would soon follow. He wasn't thinking about the courtroom or the slap. His mind, though calm on the surface, was like the quiet before a storm, calculating, assessing, preparing. The slap had been the catalyst. But it wasn't just the slap. It wasn't just the moment when Brent Rollins, in his arrogance, had exposed his true nature. It was what that slap represented. It was what the system had allowed to happen for so long. The unspoken rule that a badge could protect you from consequence, that power could insulate you from accountability, that the skin you wore, the uniform you carried, the color of your eyes could make you untouchable. But Marcus wasn't going to let it stand. He wasn't going to let the quiet, the silence be mistaken for consent. He had seen too much of it. The complacency of the system, the tolerance for abuse, the way every man who wore the uniform and carried the badge was given a free pass. But Marcus was different. He wasn't just an agent. He wasn't just someone who had been trained to follow orders. Marcus Rowe was a product of two worlds, the world of law enforcement and the world of Black America. He knew the weight of both, the price of both. He understood the rage that could ignite when the system bent too far, when the scales of justice tipped too far in one direction. But Marcus was no fool. He wasn't going to let emotion control him. He was going to do it his way, the right way. Inside his apartment, Marcus sat at his desk, the room dim, the only light coming from the screen in front of him. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, but he didn't type. Instead, he let his mind drift back to that moment in the courtroom. His father, standing tall, unbroken in front of the world. The slap was still fresh in his mind. Not the impact of it, not the sound, but the look on his father's face. Luther Rowe had stood there, blood dripping from his lip, and done what he had always done. He had endured. But this time Marcus saw it differently. This time the silence wasn't just survival. It wasn't just resignation. It was a statement that he would not be broken. Marcus didn't believe in coincidences. He didn't believe in fate. But he knew that moments like this didn't come often. They didn't come every day. They didn't come to every man. And what his father had done in that courtroom, what he had shown the world, was not just dignity, it was defiance. It was a refusal to be silenced, to be erased. The whole world could look away, but Marcus Rowe knew better. He had seen it all before. He knew how this story would end, because it had been written long before that slap landed. But this time the ending would be different. This time the monster would not walk away. This time the system would not look the other way, because Marcus had the tools to make it right. He wasn't going to let Brent Rollins, or anyone else like him, hide behind their badge anymore. He wasn't going to let them use their position to break people without consequence. It wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure that the truth came out. It was about exposing the lie that had protected men like Rollins for so long. Because Marcus knew that without the truth, without the exposure of what these men were really doing, nothing would change. And he wouldn't let that happen. He clicked through the files on his screen. There were plenty of them, records, complaints, investigations that had been brushed aside, buried under mountains of paperwork. No one had ever dared to dig deeper, to ask the questions that needed to be asked, but Marcus Rowe was not like everyone else. He had learned from his father that silence was not always the answer. Sometimes silence was the weapon, the key to unlocking a door that had been closed for too long. He opened Brent Rollins's file, and as he skimmed through the reports, the complaints, the incidents of misconduct that had been filed against him, it became clear this wasn't just one bad cop. This wasn't just one man who had lost his way. This was a pattern. This was a systemic issue, one that went far beyond Rollins. But Rollins was the key. He was the weak link in a chain that had held for far too long, and once that chain was broken, it would never be the same again. Marcus's fingers flew over the keyboard, pulling up internal affairs files, officer reports, and evidence logs. This was not a case of one man's mistake. This was the culmination of years of unchecked power, years of officers like Rollins abusing their position, knowing that nothing would happen to them. But that was about to change. The chain would break. It wasn't just the files. It wasn't just the paperwork. It was the quiet understanding that Marcus had learned from his father. There was a rhythm to the way things happened in this world. Slow, methodical, like the gears of a machine that had been built to keep turning, no matter who or what it crushed along the way. And for too long, the system had turned a blind eye. It had let men like Brent Rollins believe that the badge was all the protection they needed, that the uniform was more than just a suit of cloth. It was a shield against accountability, against truth. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the room silent except for the soft hum of the computer. His mind was still running through the moments in the courtroom. The slap that had cut through the air, his father's quiet dignity in the face of violence. Luther Rowe had stood tall, had refused to bow to the weight of the world, and now Marcus would carry that same resolve into the next phase of this war, the war to expose the rot, to dismantle the system that had allowed men like Rollins to thrive. He wasn't fooling himself. This wouldn't be easy. It never was. The wheels of justice moved, and Marcus knew better than most that even the clearest of truths could be obscured by the bureaucracy that governed them. But Marcus wasn't afraid. His entire life had been built on the principle that truth, when wielded with precision, was the most dangerous weapon in existence. And the truth was undeniable. It was there in every word spoken by Rollins, in every report, every complaint. There was a pattern, and once that pattern was revealed, the system would have no choice but to confront it. The thing about systems, Marcus knew, was that they weren't fragile, not in the way that people were. They didn't break easily, not from emotion, not from outbursts. No, they were broken by something much subtler. They were cracked open by patience, by observation, by the slow, deliberate accumulation of evidence that could not be ignored. Marcus hadn't been in this game for accolades, for praise. He hadn't come here to be a hero, to be the man everyone pointed to as the one who brought justice to a corrupt world. No, he was here for something much more personal. He was here for his father. He was here for the men and women who had been crushed under the weight of a system that refused to see them. And he was here for the moment when the system would finally be forced to confront the consequences of its actions. As he reviewed the files, pulling up information that had been hidden, ignored, or buried for years, Marcus's mind wandered back to his father. The quiet strength his father had shown that day in the courtroom wasn't just a show of endurance. It was a lesson. It was the lesson that Marcus had been taught all his life, that true power doesn't shout, doesn't demand recognition. True power is quiet, subtle, patient. It doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. It just is. And so Marcus did what he had always done. He worked. He sifted through the data, pieced together the story, identified the weak points in the system. The cracks were there, waiting to be exploited. And with every step he took, every document he reviewed, the case against Brent Rollins grew stronger. It wasn't just one incident. It was a history of abuse, a history of power used not to protect, but to destroy. And Marcus would make sure the world saw it. As the days passed, the quiet, meticulous work continued. Marcus didn't need to rush. He didn't need to jump ahead. He knew the power of waiting, of letting the evidence speak for itself. There were no shortcuts in this game, no quick victories. It was about endurance, about making sure every step, every piece of evidence was in place before making the next move. It was a chess game, and Marcus Rowe was playing with a precision that could only come from a lifetime of watching and waiting. He pulled up a new set of documents, the names of witnesses, people who had seen Rollins's abuses, people who had been silenced or intimidated. Their testimonies had been dismissed, their voices ignored. But Marcus would change that. He would make sure their stories were heard. As he combed through the evidence, Marcus's phone buzzed, breaking his concentration. He glanced at the screen, his expression unreadable. It was a text from an unknown number. "I have what you need." He didn't hesitate. He typed back, "Where?" The response came quickly. "Meet me at the old diner on Main. Come alone." Marcus stood up, pushing his chair back with the kind of deliberation that matched the quiet calculation of his mind. The room felt smaller now, tighter. It was time. He wasn't going to let anyone or anything get in the way of this. Not the system, not the people who protected it, not even the men who thought their badges gave them the right to walk above the law. They were all about to learn that Marcus Rowe was no longer a quiet observer. He was a force in motion, and nothing would stop him. He stepped out of his apartment, the weight of the day heavy on his shoulders, but not in the way one might expect. It wasn't a burden, it was a responsibility, a quiet, relentless drive to expose what had been hidden for far too long. And he would do it in the only way he knew how, with precision, with purpose, and with an unwavering belief that justice, no matter how long it took, would find its way to the surface. The diner sat quietly on Main Street, a relic from another time, its neon sign flickering with an almost melancholy rhythm. It was the kind of place you'd expect to see old men hunched over coffee, their hands shaking as they sifted through newspapers that hadn't seen a front page in years. The tables were worn, the booths a faded shade of red that had long since lost their luster. But the air inside was still thick with history, each corner of the room steeped in the quiet conversations of the past. The kind that would never make headlines. Marcus Rowe stepped through the door, his shoes making a soft sound against the cracked tile floor. He didn't look around, didn't scan the room for familiar faces. He knew exactly where to go. At the far corner, near the window, a figure sat alone, their face obscured by the shadow of a worn baseball cap. The man didn't look up when Marcus approached, didn't move or acknowledge his presence in any way. He simply sat, waiting, as though this meeting were just another mundane chapter in the story of his life. Marcus slid into the booth opposite him, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the man's features. Middle-aged, his face rough and worn by years of a life lived outside the rules. But there was something about him, something in his eyes that told Marcus this man had seen more than he'd ever let on. "You've got it, don't you?" Marcus asked, his voice low but firm. He wasn't interested in small talk. There was no room for it now. The man nodded once, slow and deliberate, before pulling a small, battered USB drive from his jacket pocket and sliding it across the table. Marcus didn't touch it right away. Instead, he studied the man's face for a moment longer, his eyes sharp, his mind already calculating the next steps. "You know what's on there?" Marcus asked. The man's eyes flicked up, meeting his for the first time. There was something in those eyes, something tired and resigned, as if he had already made peace with the price of his actions. "Yeah," he replied, "every last piece of evidence you need to bring him down. The recordings, the files, the internal memos, everything." Marcus's fingers brushed the edge of the USB drive, but he didn't pick it up. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his gaze never leaving the man's eyes. "You're sure about this?" The man's face hardened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I'm sure. I've been doing this long enough to know when I've crossed the line. This goes beyond loyalty to the badge. This goes beyond all of it. It's bigger than Rollins. It's about what he represents, what they all represent. You want to fix the system, right? You need this." Marcus finally picked up the drive, his fingers wrapping around it with a sense of finality. He could feel the weight of the man's words settling inside him, like stones being dropped into the bottom of his stomach. This wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about the entire system, about everything that had been allowed to go unchecked for so long. The ugly truth was about to be laid bare, and Marcus would be the one to make sure it saw the light of day. "Is it safe?" Marcus asked. The man nodded. "As safe as it can be. I erased every trace of it from my system, used ghost protocols to keep it off the grid. They won't trace it back to you, not if you move fast. But you know what they'll do if they find out it's gone. They'll come for you." Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't need to. The risk was part of the job, part of the fight. It always had been. "You won't have to worry about me," Marcus said, his voice steady, his mind already working ahead. "This isn't about me. This is about making sure they never do this again. Never think they're untouchable." The man looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he slid out of the booth and stood up. There was no handshake, no goodbye. He just turned and walked out of the diner, disappearing into the night, like a shadow that had outlived its time. Marcus remained at the table for a moment longer, staring down at the USB drive in his hand. The world outside had gone quiet, the hum of the city muffled by the weight of what was about to happen. He knew that the path he was walking would not lead to applause or recognition. It would lead to a deeper kind of justice, one that wouldn't be measured in headlines or viral posts. It would be measured in truth, in the quiet, steady impact of exposing a system that had long been broken. And it was time to begin. Marcus stood up, his hand slipping the USB drive into his pocket. He knew what he had to do. There were no more delays, no more waiting. It was time to push forward. Time to force the system to face its own reflection. As he stepped out of the diner, the cold night air hit him like a wall, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. But he didn't feel it, not yet. Right now, there was only the clarity of the work ahead. There was no room for distractions, no time for doubt. He got into his car and started the engine, the soft hum of the vehicle cutting through the stillness of the night. As he pulled away from the curb, his mind was already on the next step. The files, the recordings, the damning evidence, it was all there, ready to be used, ready to be exposed. And Brent Rollins, the man who thought he could slap a Cheshire-year-old black man and get away with it, would soon find out just how wrong he was. Marcus didn't need to look back. He didn't need to remind himself of the consequences. He knew what was coming, and as he drove through the streets, the world around him seemed to slow, as if the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for the first domino to fall. The battle was about to begin. The roads were slick with the residue of the evening's rain as Marcus drove toward the federal building. The windshield wipers moved back and forth with the rhythmic precision of a metronome, but they did little to wash away the weight in his chest. He'd been doing this for years, walking the line between duty and justice, but this was different. This wasn't a case, it wasn't a suspect. It was the very fabric of the system, and he was about to tear it apart. His phone buzzed in the pocket of his coat, and he reached for it without taking his eyes off the road. A message from his colleague, Thomas Learard. "Your plan is in motion. The surveillance team is set up. It's time." He typed back quickly, the words clear and clipped. "Understood. I'll be there in Shiwu." The streets were nearly empty now, the hum of the city softened by the quiet weight of night. Marcus drove with a single purpose, to finish what had started with the slap, what had been set in motion the moment his father had walked into that courtroom, blood dripping from his lip but dignity intact. The buildings he passed were nothing more than shadows in the dark, dark towers that seemed to press in from every side. There was a dissonance in the way the world moved around him, as though everything was slightly out of sync, like a clock that had run too long without maintenance. But the system Marcus was working to expose, to break, wasn't broken. Not yet. Not enough. It was functional in a way that kept people like Brent Rollins safe, kept them insulated from the consequences of their actions. It was this that Marcus was going to fix, or the hum of the engine was all that accompanied him as he pulled into the parking garage beneath the federal building. He'd been here so many times before, but tonight it felt different. There was no buzz of activity, no frantic energy, just the hollow echo of tires on concrete and the soft thump of the car's engine shutting off. He stepped out of the car, the sharpness of the night air biting at his skin. The building before him loomed like a monument to bureaucracy, to law, to the ideals of justice that were so often ignored or perverted. Marcus didn't look up at the glass and steel structure, didn't let his mind wander to the idealism that had once guided him through the academy. Instead, he kept his focus steady, kept his mind on the task at hand. As he entered the building, the familiar scent of old wood and dust mixed with the sterile scent of cleaning products. The quiet seemed to settle around him, a stark contrast to the intensity of what was about to unfold. He passed a security guard at the entrance, gave a brief nod, and continued on without breaking his stride. The halls were quiet, the sounds of footfalls echoing off the marble floors as he moved deeper into the building. He reached his office, where the familiar hum of the fluorescent lights greeted him. It was a sterile space, functional, impersonal. But tonight, it was a war room, and every inch of it felt charged with the electricity of the battle ahead. He sat at his desk, pulling the USB drive from his coat pocket. He connected it to his computer, the screen lighting up with the files that would bring Brent Rollins down. Marcus didn't flinch as the data started to load. He had seen it before, the pattern, the abuse, the lies. Each report, each complaint, each witness statement. He had been through it all 100 times, but tonight, it wasn't about the documents anymore. It was about what would happen after. It was about showing the world that men like Brent Rollins could no longer hide behind their badges. The door to his office opened, and Marcus looked up, his gaze steady. Thomas Lairard stood in the doorway, his expression a mix of quiet determination and respect. He didn't speak immediately, but his eyes scanned the room, taking in the weight of what was unfolding. "You ready?" Marcus asked, his voice steady, though the tension in his body betrayed the urgency of the moment. Lairard nodded. "We've got everything in place. The surveillance team is locked in. We've tapped into every channel we can. This ends tonight." Marcus looked back at the screen. The files were ready. The evidence was irrefutable. It was time to pull the trigger. "Let's do it," Marcus said, his voice calm but resolute. Lairard stepped forward and placed a small stack of printed documents on the desk. "This is everything we need to make it stick. The connections between Rollins and the judge, the internal memos, the files that were buried, it's all there. It'll be enough to take him down." "And more?" Marcus nodded. He didn't need to look at the documents. He already knew what they contained. But the quiet weight of Laird's words, the finality of them, made something shift in the air. This wasn't just about one man's downfall. It was about taking a wrecking ball to the system itself, about showing that even the most entrenched figures of power could be brought to their knees. Lairard left without another word, and Marcus was alone again, the weight of the files before him the only company he needed. He stared at the screen, letting the reality of what he was about to do sink in. This was it, the moment that would change everything. But in that moment, Marcus found himself thinking not of Rollins or the system he was about to expose, but of his father, Luther Rowe, the man who had taught him that silence could be more powerful than any shout. That patience was the key to dismantling even the most powerful forces. And Marcus realized then that his father had given him something more than just lessons on how to endure. He had given him the tools to destroy the very system that had abused him, that had kept men like Brent Rollins insulated from the consequences of their actions. Marcus took a deep breath, his fingers hovering over the keys. His mind was clear now, and the pieces fell into place. This wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure that the system, the very thing that had allowed this to happen, could no longer ignore it. It was about holding people accountable, from the officers to the judges, from the men who wore badges to the ones who turned their heads. The clock was ticking. Marcus hit send, and the files were on their way. The system was about to feel the weight of its own sins, and Brent Rollins would never walk free again. The hum of the computers in Marcus Rowe's office became a distant backdrop as the files were sent into the ether of the system, reaching out toward those who would receive them with an unspoken understanding of what was about to unfold. His hands remained steady as they hovered over the desk for just a moment longer, the weight of his decision pressing against his chest like an unspoken promise. He didn't need to wait for confirmation. The ball was already rolling, and it would not stop until the pieces had fallen into place. He stood and left the office, his footsteps echoing down the halls, resonating with an undeniable finality. He didn't look back. There would be no turning back. He had already made the choice, not just for his father, but for everyone who had suffered under the weight of men like Rollins, for the people who had quietly borne their burdens, who had suffered in silence, waiting for someone, anyone, to bring the truth to light. Marcus Rowe had made his choice, and it was one that would shake the foundation of everything they knew. Outside the federal building, the night air had taken on an almost otherworldly stillness. The city, once alive with the noise of cars, people, and machines, now seemed to hold its breath. It was as if the world knew something was coming, something it couldn't stop. Marcus stepped into his car and pulled away from the curb, his mind already on the task ahead. He didn't need to look at the road to know where he was going. His destination was already set, and the only thing left was to see it through. The streets were quiet, the neon signs of nearby businesses flickering like ghosts in the dark. He passed through them without a second glance, his focus sharpened. This wasn't about the city. This wasn't about the noise. This was about something much bigger. It was about the kind of justice that had been denied for far too long. The feeling in his chest wasn't fear. It wasn't even anticipation. It was something quieter, something steadier. It was the calm before the storm. The system that had protected men like Brent Rollins had always relied on one thing: silence. But now, the silence was being used against it. What Marcus had done, sending the files, exposing the rot, it would break the silence. It would turn the system's own mechanisms against it. As Marcus pulled into a secluded parking garage, he checked his phone. A message from Lerard. "It's done. The files are live. They're already in the right hands." Marcus nodded to himself, though there was no one around to see it. The world had changed in the last few hours, and it was moving toward a reckoning. He turned off the engine and sat in the car for a moment, letting the weight of the situation settle into his bones. There was no victory to be had, not yet. He wasn't here to celebrate. The next steps would be taken with precision and care. He entered the building through the back entrance, moving quickly, but without hurry. There was no need to rush now. He had done the hardest part. The truth had already been set in motion. Now all he had to do was wait for it to unfold. The team in the surveillance room was already monitoring the progress. They had eyes on Rollins, on the judge, and on the people who had long been complicit in the system. The footage, the recordings, the testimony, it was all there, being processed in real time. Every moment, every conversation, every lie had been captured. The walls that had protected men like Rollins were about to come down. Marcus walked into the conference room, his presence immediately commanding the attention of those in the room. His colleagues were already gathered around, their expressions a mix of tension and quiet anticipation. They knew what was at stake, and they knew what this moment meant. But there was no grand speech, no rallying cry. This wasn't a war of words, it was a war of truth. And truth didn't need to be shouted. "You know what to do," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying through the room without effort. The room buzzed to life as the team began their work, pulling up the data from the files, matching the dates, times, and locations with the evidence that had been uncovered. It was all there. Everything that had been hidden, everything that had been swept under the rug for years. The truth was no longer in the shadows, it was front and center, ready to be exposed. Hours passed in silence, the only sound the soft clatter of keyboards and the occasional murmur of voices. Marcus didn't move from his seat, his eyes fixed on the screen in front of him. The system was being flooded with information, and soon it would no longer be able to keep the truth at bay. Rollins had thought he could walk away from the slap. He had believed that he could return to his life, to the comfort of his uniform, to the protection of the badge. But that illusion was about to be shattered. And as the evidence continued to pour in, one undeniable truth became clear. Brent Rollins was not the exception. He was the rule. He was a product of a system that had been designed to protect men like him, to allow them to operate above the law. And now, that system was crumbling under the weight of its own corruption. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the edge of the table. This wasn't just about Rollins anymore. It was about everyone who had turned a blind eye, everyone who had covered for him, everyone who had allowed this to continue for far too long. The truth was coming for them all, and it would not stop until it had brought them to account. The clock on the wall ticked quietly, and for a moment Marcus allowed himself to close his eyes. He wasn't done yet, but the first step had been taken. The system would be forced to confront its own lies. And when that happened, there would be no hiding from the truth. Stretched into the early morning, the steady hum of Marcus's team filling the room like the ticking of an unseen clock. Each keystroke, each document, each piece of footage was another arrow shot at those in the system. The evidence was no longer just a collection of reports and files. It had become a living, breathing force, a truth that had been buried under decades of silence, and now it was rising. Marcus sat still, his eyes locked on the screen, the quiet intensity of the work surrounding him like a second skin. His mind was focused. Brent Rollins had been the face of this system for far too long, but Marcus knew better. Rollins was merely a component in the machine of the system, a reflection of everything that had gone wrong. The system had created him, protected him, and allowed him to become who he was today. But now the system was crumbling, and there was no one left to protect it. The sound of the door opening behind him pulled Marcus from his thoughts, but he didn't turn. He didn't need to. He knew who it was before the footsteps even reached his ear. Lerard, his colleague, his ally, the man who had helped him set this in motion, the one who would stand beside him as the walls came crashing down. Everything's in place, Lerard said, his voice low but steady. The leak has already started. Media outlets are picking up the files, the footage. The news is beginning to spread, and there's already pressure mounting. Marcus nodded, but his focus never wavered. The key is the timing, he said, his voice calm but filled with quiet resolve. We need to keep the pressure on them, but we can't let them control the narrative. Not yet. We can't let them turn this into a spectacle. It has to be about the facts, the truth, the undeniable evidence. Lerard's eyes flicked over to the monitors, the glow from the screens illuminating his face. It's already starting to shift, he said quietly. Social media is ablaze. People are talking. The hashtags are trending. They're already calling for Rollins's removal. Marcus's lips pressed together into a thin line, but he didn't respond immediately. He wasn't interested in the noise of the public, the endless commentary. It was all part of the distraction. This was never about the headlines. This was about change, real, substantive change. And that couldn't be achieved through spectacle. It had to come from within, from the people who had the courage to stand up and face the truth. Lerard seemed to sense the direction of Marcus's thoughts. You're right, he said after a long pause, but they won't be able to ignore this much longer. The system is in motion now, and it's heading for a crash. Marcus finally turned to face him, his eyes steady and unblinking. The crash is inevitable, he said, his voice filled with a quiet certainty. But the rebuilding has to come after. We can't just tear it down. We have to build something better. Lerard didn't respond. He didn't need to. They both knew the weight of the work ahead. What Marcus was doing wasn't just about one man. It was about an entire system that had allowed people like Rollins to thrive. A system that had systematically protected them, turned a blind eye to their actions, and silenced those who had the courage to speak out. Marcus had seen it all. He had been raised in it. The quiet complicity of those who looked the other way. The subtle whispers that told him not to rock the boat, to play by the rules, to let things slide. But the system wasn't just broken. It was corrupt. And now it was being forced to confront that reality. He stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the room. The team working with a quiet intensity, their fingers flying over keyboards, their screens filled with images of the very rot they were about to expose. He didn't need to say anything more. The work was being done, and it would not be undone. Marcus turned back to the screen in front of him, the data now pouring in faster than before. The connections were being made, the links were being exposed, and the weight of it was suffocating. But Marcus wasn't afraid. He wasn't daunted by the enormity of it, because he knew something that the system had forgotten. The truth would always find a way out. No matter how deep it was buried, No matter how many layers of deception were piled on top of it, the truth was like water. It would seep through cracks, it would find the light, and it would flood the walls. The sun had risen by the time Marcus left the building. His eyes were tired, but his mind was clearer than it had been in years. The sky was streaked with orange and purple, the soft glow of dawn beginning to break through the dark shroud of night. He stood for a moment outside the federal building, taking a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. Fill his lungs. It felt like a moment of peace, a brief respite before the storm. As he walked down the steps, the silence of the morning seemed almost surreal. The city had not yet woken up fully, the streets still empty, the cars passing by with barely a sound. The calm felt like a thin veil over the chaos that was about to unfold. For the first time in a long time, Marcus allowed himself a moment to simply exist. To reflect. His phone buzzed in his pocket again, the sharp vibration pulling him back to reality. He didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. Leorard's name flashed in his notifications, and with a soft exhale, Marcus answered. "It's happening," Leorard said, his voice tight with anticipation. The first wave of news reports just hit. Rollins's past is being dragged out into the light, and it's only going to get worse from here. Marcus walked towards his car, his steps slow but steady. He wasn't surprised. He had known it would happen this way, that the revelations would snowball, that the truth would overwhelm the walls that had protected men like Brent Rollins for so long. But there was no satisfaction in it, no relief. There was only the heavy weight of knowing that it had to be done. "I don't need to know the details," Marcus said, his voice even. "I need to know that this goes all the way, that it's not just Rollins, that we take down the whole system." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I hear you," Leorard replied, the weight of Marcus's words settling between them. "But the truth is, Marcus, you've already done what you needed to do. The system's on its knees, and it's not getting up." Marcus's jaw tightened. The words were true, but they didn't settle the ache that had been with him for years. This wasn't just about Brent Rollins. It wasn't about one man or one case. It was about the larger, more insidious machine that had allowed the brutality to persist. "You're right," Marcus said, his voice quieter now, "but this isn't over, not yet. We don't stop until the entire system is held accountable, until we make sure it never happens again." Leorard didn't argue. He knew better than to challenge Marcus when he was this focused, this unyielding. "I'll keep you updated," he said, "but I'm with you every step of the way." The line went dead, and Marcus slid his phone back into his pocket. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The first wave of news might have broken, but there were deeper waters to navigate. The public outcry, the legal battles, the media frenzy, they were all part of it. But the hardest part was still ahead. Marcus got into his car and started the engine, the low rumble of the motor pulling him from his thoughts. He drove through the city, his hand steady on the wheel. He didn't need to be told that Rollins's life was over. He didn't need to be told that the media would tear him apart, that the public would demand his blood. That was inevitable. What mattered was that the truth had found its way out. It had already set things in motion, and now Marcus had to make sure it stayed that way. The city around him began to wake up, the streets filling with the usual morning bustle. People moved quickly, heads down, focused on their own lives, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Marcus didn't care about the noise. He had been in the shadows for so long, watching the machine turn, watching the gears grind with brutal precision. He was used to it. He had become accustomed to being a ghost, to moving unseen through the machinery. But now, he was no longer a shadow. He was a force in motion. By the time he reached his apartment, the weight of the work ahead felt like a familiar companion. He didn't enter immediately. Instead, he stood outside for a moment, looking up at the dark sky, the first stars already visible in the fading light. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, as if letting go of all the tension that had been building up over the last few days, weeks, months. When he entered the apartment, The silence greeted him like an old friend. It wasn't a comforting silence, though. It was the silence of someone who had already seen too much, someone who had learned that peace wasn't something you could seek out. It was something that found you after the battle. Marcus walked through the apartment, moving almost mechanically. He stripped off his jacket, his tie, and let the weight of it all fall away. He didn't sit down right away. He didn't need to. He was too wired, too alert. The silence in the room was too thick, too heavy with what was coming. The phone buzzed again, and Marcus picked it up without hesitation. This time, it was from his father. "Marcus," Luther's voice crackled through the line, strong and steady as always. "It's done. I know what you've done. I know what you're working on. You've already broken their walls down." Marcus let out a slow breath. "It's not over yet." "I know," Luther replied, his voice quiet now, almost as if he was weighing his words. "But you're getting closer. And you know something? Sometimes the hardest part of all this is knowing when to stop." Marcus's eyes flicked to the window, where the first rays of sunlight were beginning to creep through the blinds. "I'm not stopping until I know I've finished it, until I've made sure they never do this again." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and Marcus didn't speak. He let the silence stretch, knowing it wasn't something to be filled. It was a moment of understanding between two men who had lived through too much not to recognize when words were unnecessary. Finally, Luther spoke again, his voice soft but filled with an unspoken strength. "Don't forget why you're doing this, Marcus. Don't forget who you're doing it for." Marcus didn't reply immediately. He didn't need to. His father's words were already etched into his mind, already part of the reason he had started this journey in the first place. The truth was always the hardest thing to find, but it was also the most powerful weapon. "I won't forget," Marcus said quietly. The line went dead, and Marcus stood there for a moment longer, letting the weight of the conversation settle into him. The work was far from over, but there was a sense of peace in knowing that he was finally doing what needed to be done. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it never was. And as long as he held on to the truth, he knew he would walk it until the very end. The weight of the morning's conversation with his father still clung to Marcus as he walked through the quiet hallways of his apartment building. The walls were stark, as if deliberately stripped of any personality, designed to leave nothing but the bare essentials. Just like Marcus's life, in many ways, stripped down to a cold, clinical pursuit of truth, a relentless chase that had begun years ago and was now finally beginning to bear fruit. The irony of it, though, was that for the first time in years, it wasn't the pursuit of justice that drove him. It was the undeniable, grinding need to fix something that had broken far before his time. He closed the door to his apartment behind him and stood for a moment, letting the quiet seep into his bones. It was rare for him to experience moments of true silence, even rarer for him to let them linger. Every part of his life was a push forward, a constant motion toward a future that was never as tangible as it appeared. But in that quiet, there was space. Space to remember his father's lessons. Space to realize that this wasn't just about fighting for justice. It was about the people, the faces, the stories that had been swept under the rug for too long. The phone buzzed again, and Marcus didn't hesitate to pick it up. The number that flashed across the screen was one he had become familiar with over the last few days. It was Lee Erard again. "We've got another breakthrough." Lee Erard's voice came through, tight with urgency. "The local news just picked up the leaked footage of Rollins at that diner. You know, the one with the woman he assaulted. It's already going viral." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he stayed calm. "Is it clean? Are we sure they haven't edited it?" "It's clean," Erard confirmed. "There's no getting around this. It's him, no doubt about it." Marcus exhaled slowly, rubbing his thumb over the edge of his phone. The footage was one of the many suppressed incidents, one of the many that had never seen the light of day until now. The sickening thing was how much of it had been brushed aside, hidden behind a shield of paperwork and a badge. It wasn't just that Rollins had been brutal. It was that the entire system had shielded him. It had kept him safe, wrapped him in the safety of bureaucracy until he believed he was invincible. "Good," Marcus said, his voice steady, but a new edge had entered it. "That's going to help push this forward, but we need to keep this momentum. We need to start making it impossible for anyone to ignore what he's done. You're going to need to move fast," Leonard warned. "The pressure's already mounting. Some of the higher-ups are already calling for Rollins's immediate resignation, but we know it's bigger than that. This isn't just about him. This is about the entire structure that protected him." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "The structure needs to fall. I'm not interested in resignations. I'm interested in accountability." He hung up the phone and sat for a moment in the chair by his window, staring out into the early morning light. The city outside was waking up, but his mind was far from the bustling streets. His thoughts were on Rollins, on the corrupt system that had allowed such men to thrive, and on the faces of the people who had been crushed under their weight. He thought of the woman at the diner, the one whose assault had been ignored for so long, and he could feel the heat of the injustice burning in his chest. This was about more than one man, and it was about more than one incident. It was about a pattern, a history of violence that had been hidden in plain sight. He stood up slowly, walking to his desk where a stack of files awaited his attention. They weren't the kind of files he liked, messy, incomplete, missing pieces. They were the kind of cases that had been neglected, swept aside, forgotten. But Marcus wasn't going to forget. Not today, not ever. He opened the first file, his fingers flipping through the documents. As he read, a cold rage began to simmer beneath the surface. The stories were all too familiar. Men and women, victims of police brutality, their cases dismissed, their lives reduced to paperwork. Their stories had been buried by the very system that was meant to protect them. But now, Marcus was going to dig them all up. Every single one of them. His thoughts turned once more to his father's words. Luther had always taught him that justice wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about bringing down those who had wronged you. It was about correction, about making sure that those who had caused harm were held accountable. And that, Marcus thought, was what made it so much harder than the easy option of retaliation. To seek justice without vengeance was an act of restraint, an act of patience, an act of clarity. And that was exactly what Marcus Rowe had to offer. The next few hours passed in a blur. He worked tirelessly, the files before him transforming from a jumbled mess of incomplete reports into something more, a weapon, a testament to the lives lost, the victims ignored, the justice delayed. Each page he turned over felt like another step toward exposing the truth. The phone calls came and went, Leonard updating him on the progress of the public reaction, his team gathering more evidence, more footage. The walls were closing in on Rollins, but Marcus knew that it wasn't just about Rollins anymore. It was about the institution that had allowed him to rise to power, about the corruption that ran so deep it had infected every part of the system. Marcus stood up and walked over to the window again, his gaze sweeping over the city below. The world seemed to be moving forward, oblivious to the storm that was brewing beneath the surface. People walked the streets, heads down, lost in their own worlds, unaware of the tidal wave that was about to crash down on the very system that had once protected men like Rollins. But Marcus knew better. He knew the storm was already coming. It wasn't something that could be stopped. It was something that had been set in motion the moment he decided to act. The early morning's calm was nothing more than a facade, a brief pause before the chaos that would inevitably follow. Marcus stood by the window, watching as the city stretched awake, each light flickering on in a rhythm that mirrored his thoughts. The world outside was oblivious, caught up in the humdrum of routine, unaware of the quiet storm raging beneath it all. But Marcus knew better. He knew the first cracks had appeared, and from there the floodgates would open. The phone rang again, pulling him from his thoughts. He reached for it with a practiced efficiency, not needing to check the name that flashed across the screen. Leerard was on the other end. "Rollins is going to speak soon," Leerard said, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of urgency. "The press has been pushing for a statement, and he's been silent long enough. He's about to do damage control." Marcus's hand tightened around the phone, his grip unwavering. The silence that had surrounded Rollins for so long was about to break, and Marcus knew that this moment was crucial. It wasn't just about the words Rollins would say. It was about how the public would respond to them. This was his last chance to ensure that the truth didn't get lost in the noise. "Do we have any control over the narrative?" Marcus asked, his voice calm, but beneath it, a storm of thoughts and strategies were already beginning to churn. "Not much," Leerard replied, "but we've already got some pieces in place. The public's attention is shifting. Social media is already all over him, and some key figures are already starting to speak up about the pattern of abuse. It's making it harder for him to spin this." Marcus nodded, though Leerard couldn't see it. It was a small victory, but it wasn't enough. The real battle wasn't in the court of public opinion. It was in the courtroom. It was in the system that had allowed men like Rollins to operate unchecked for so long. "I'll be there," Marcus said, the decision made as soon as the words left his lips. "Keep me updated. I need to know the second he steps into the public eye." He ended the call and walked over to his desk, his eyes scanning the files that lay there. The work was far from over. The walls had started to crack, but there was still so much left to expose. The truth had been freed, but that didn't mean the fight was finished. It was only just beginning. Marcus gathered his things, his mind already running through the logistics of the day. The pressure was mounting, the stakes higher than they had ever been. He had known from the moment the investigation started that this would be the hardest battle of his life, but now it felt different. Now it was personal, not just because of Rollins, but because of everything that had led to this moment. He stepped out of his apartment, the cool morning air brushing against his skin as he made his way down the stairwell. The building was quiet, the hum of the city outside growing louder as he descended. He could feel it, the anticipation, the heaviness of what was to come. The weight of it was almost unbearable, but he had long ago learned how to carry it. Outside, the streets were alive with movement, cars rushing by, people walking briskly to their destinations. But Marcus wasn't one of them. He was walking with purpose, his mind focused on the task at hand. The truth was already in motion, but it wasn't enough to just expose it. It had to be made undeniable, unassailable, and that meant taking down Rollins, not just as an individual, but as a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with the system. The courthouse loomed in front of him, its imposing structure a stark reminder of the work that had yet to be done. Marcus walked up the steps, his heart steady, his mind clear. There were no distractions, no doubts. There was only the weight of the truth and the relentless drive to see it through. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. The press had already gathered, cameras flashing as reporters jockeyed for position. Marcus moved through the crowd with ease, his presence barely registering among the chaos. He had done this before, moved through the noise, stayed unnoticed, always watching, always waiting for the right moment to strike. He didn't stop to speak to anyone. He didn't need to. His focus was singular, his purpose clear. As he entered the courtroom, the tension in the air thickened, the weight of the moment hanging over them all. Marcus took his seat, his eyes scanning the room. The defense was already there, as was the prosecution, but there was a palpable difference now. Everyone knew that something was about to change. Everyone knew that Rollins's fate was hanging in the balance. The doors to the courtroom opened with a quiet groan, and all eyes turned toward the entrance. The man they had all been waiting for walked in, his face locked in that familiar, smug expression. Brent Rollins, the man who had worn his badge like armor, the man who had lived above the law for so long that he had come to believe he was untouchable. He walked in like a king, but Marcus could see it in his eyes. There was something different now. The confidence was there, but it was starting to waver. The truth was out, and Rollins knew it. He could feel the walls closing in around him. As Rollins took his seat, the courtroom fell into a hush. It wasn't the kind of silence that spoke of reverence. It was the kind of silence that came before a storm. The storm that had been brewing for far too long. The storm that Marcus Rowe had unleashed. Lerard's voice echoed in Marcus's ear as he sat in the courtroom, his eyes trained on Rollins. "He's about to speak. Get ready." Marcus didn't need to be told. He had been ready for this moment for longer than he cared to admit. This wasn't just about one man. This was about the reckoning that had been a long time coming. Rollins cleared his throat, and the silence in the room seemed to thicken, if that was even possible. His eyes scanned the room, but they never once landed on Marcus. No, he didn't have the courage to face the truth. Not yet. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't the defiance Marcus had expected. It wasn't the calculated arrogance that had been his trademark for so many years. What came out of Rollins's mouth was desperation, a faint tremor in his voice that made the room feel colder. The words were the same, the rehearsed lines that had been scripted for him in preparation for the moment, the damage control. But there was no hiding the fear that lurked beneath them. "I've been unfairly targeted," Rollins began, his voice shaky but firm, "and the allegations against me are misrepresented." It was a familiar song, one that had been sung many times before by those who thought they could get away with it. But this time, the world was watching. The world wasn't going to let him hide behind his badge any longer. Marcus's eyes never left Rollins as the man continued his feeble defense. There was nothing new here. No revelations, no remorse, just more of the same. But Marcus knew something Rollins didn't. This was his final performance. The curtain was coming down. The words spilled from Rollins's mouth, each one a feeble attempt to rebuild what had already crumbled. He spoke of his record, of his years of service, of the dangers he had faced. His voice cracked in places, a thin veneer of authority slipping under the weight of the truth. But Marcus remained unblinking, his gaze unwavering. He had seen this act before, the denial, the anger, the refusal to accept responsibility. But this time it wasn't going to work. This time the mask was slipping for good. Rollins's eyes darted around the room, seeking out support that no longer existed. But there was no sympathetic glance, no nods of approval. Not anymore. The jury remained still, their faces unreadable. The press, who had once fawned over his bravado, now took every word down with the same mechanical precision. Even the attorneys, who had been hired to defend him, seemed to be quietly preparing for the inevitable collapse. It wasn't that Marcus was particularly invested in watching Rollins's unraveling. It wasn't that he took pleasure in seeing a man he'd long despised finally lose control. No, this was not about revenge. It was never about revenge. It was about making sure the system, the institution that had protected men like Rollins for so long, understood one thing: this time it would not win. Rollins's voice shook again as he continued, speaking of his commitment to the job, his dedication to the community. But there was a tremor in his words, now the facade cracking more and more with every passing second. He wasn't just losing his grip on the narrative, he was losing himself. People like me," Rollins continued, his eyes darting nervously, "we do what we have to keep the peace, to keep things from falling apart." Marcus's hand clenched into a fist beneath the table. The words were familiar, the same tired arguments that had been used to justify every act of brutality, every violation of human rights. Rollins spoke as though his actions were justified by the chaos he claimed to be keeping in check. But Marcus knew better. He had seen the truth, and now it was impossible to unsee. "You think the world owes you an apology," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. His words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that made Rollins flinch. "You think the blood on your hands is somehow justified by the badge you wear. But that badge doesn't make you above the law. It doesn't give you the right to break people and call it service." For a moment there was silence. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that follows a truth that has been exposed, too raw to ignore. Rollins's face twisted into something resembling rage, but there was no heat in his expression, no passion, just fear. "I've kept this city safe," Rollins spat, his eyes now narrowing, the last threads of his composure unraveling. "I've kept it clean. You don't understand. You don't get what it's like out there." Marcus met his gaze without blinking. "I understand perfectly," he said, his voice low and steady. "I understand that you think fear is the same as respect. I understand that you think silence is consent. But I'm telling you now, silence doesn't mean consent. It means we've been waiting. We've been watching. And now we're going to hold you accountable." Rollins's eyes flashed with a mixture of panic and defiance. The weight of Marcus's words hit harder than any physical blow could. There was nothing left to say, no defense he could mount that would carry any weight. His narrative had been shattered, and all he had left was a feeble attempt to regain some control, some illusion of power. The judge, who had remained silent through most of the exchange, finally banged her gavel. "Enough," she commanded, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "We will now move to the next phase of the proceedings." But Marcus knew that the damage had already been done. Rollins's attempt to control the narrative had failed. He had shown his cards, and they were nothing but a house of lies built on a foundation of violence. And now everyone knew. The room buzzed with a low hum as the proceedings moved forward. But Marcus's mind was elsewhere. His thoughts were not on the courtroom drama, not on Rollins's desperate attempts to claw his way out of the hole he had dug for himself. His mind was on the larger picture, the system, the institution that had allowed Rollins to operate with impunity for so long. That was the real enemy, the real target. And it was beginning to show cracks, just like Rollins. As the judge called the next witness, Marcus stood up and slipped out of the courtroom, his footsteps echoing. He didn't need to watch the rest of the trial. He didn't need to see the man who had broken so many lives crumble before the court. That wasn't the victory. The victory was in what came next. The victory would be in the changes that had already begun, in the lessons that had already been learned. Marcus stepped into the fresh air outside, feeling the weight of the world settle back onto his shoulders. It wasn't over yet, not by a long shot, but it would be soon. The public was already on fire with outrage. The pressure was mounting on the justice system, on the men and women who had allowed Rollins's actions to go unchecked for so long. But it wasn't just Rollins. It was every person who had hidden behind the badge, behind the walls of bureaucracy and power, and thought they were untouchable. He walked to his car, the cool breeze brushing past him, and for a moment he allowed himself to close his eyes, just long enough to feel something more than the heaviness of the fight. There was a flicker of something inside him, a light that had been absent for so long. It wasn't hope. It wasn't relief. It was something quieter, something more resolute. Justice was no longer a dream. It was a process. And it was happening, one step at a time. The drive back to his office was a blur of city streets and fading sunlight, the weight of the day pressing down on Marcus's shoulders. The world outside the car window was moving at its usual pace, people rushing to their destinations, oblivious to the tectonic shift that was unfolding beneath their feet. But Marcus was acutely aware of it. This wasn't just about the trial or the man sitting in a courtroom pleading his case. It was about something larger. It was about the reckoning that was finally coming, not just for Brent Rollins, but for the entire institution that had shielded him for so long. He parked his car in the same spot he always did, a nondescript space in a lot tucked between two tall buildings. There was nothing glamorous about it, nothing remarkable. Just another reminder that the real work wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about doing what needed to be done, whether anyone noticed or not. Marcus stepped out of the car, his mind still swirling with thoughts of the day's events. The words Rollins had spoken, the desperation in his voice, the way the man had tried to convince everyone that he was the victim. It wasn't just a lie, it was a distortion of reality, an attempt to rewrite history. And Marcus knew it was just the beginning. Inside his office, the air was cooler, quieter, more controlled. He walked to his desk, his eyes scanning the files that were waiting for him. Each one was another piece of the puzzle, another chapter in a long story of injustice and corruption. But today they didn't seem as daunting. Today they seemed like the final steps towards something bigger, something that, for once, felt like it could actually change the world. The phone buzzed on his desk, pulling him from his thoughts. He picked it up without looking at the screen, knowing it was Leerard again. "It's starting to break," Leerard said, his voice tinged with something that sounded like both relief and disbelief. "Rollins's defense is starting to unravel faster than we thought. The press is pushing harder now, and some key figures are getting involved. The shift is real, Marcus." Marcus didn't need to ask for details. He had been following it all. The public reaction had been swift, the outrage palpable. Social media had exploded with memes, hashtags, and video clips, all underscoring one simple message: you slapped the wrong man. But Marcus knew that the real work wasn't in the viral trends or the hashtags. It was in the quiet, behind-the-scenes work. The paperwork, the audits, the interviews with witnesses, the calls to local officials. That was where the change would come. The noise would fade, but the truth would remain. "Good," Marcus said, his voice steady, his eyes focused on the stack of files in front of him. "This is just the beginning. We need to keep the pressure on. Don't let them shift the narrative. This isn't about Rollins anymore. This is about every man and woman who's ever been buried by this system." Leerard didn't argue. He knew exactly what Marcus meant. This wasn't just about one man's downfall. It was about dismantling the machinery that allowed people like Rollins to thrive, that protected them, that turned a blind eye to their brutality. "You've got my full support," Leerard said, before ending the call. "Just say the word." Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring at the stack of files on his desk. The work was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like they were on the cusp of something monumental. The silence had been broken, and now it was time for the truth to come pouring out like a flood that couldn't be contained. He didn't have time to savor the small victories. His mind was already on the next step, already thinking ahead. There was no room for complacency. There was only the relentless march toward justice, toward fixing a broken system that had allowed so much pain, so much suffering to go unchecked for far too long. And then, just as he was about to turn his attention back to the files in front of him, or to his office open, it wasn't Leerard. It wasn't anyone from his team. It was someone else. A face he hadn't expected to see, a face he hadn't seen in years. His father, Luther Rowe, stood in the doorway, his expression calm, but his eyes holding a depth of knowing that made Marcus pause. "I thought I'd find you here," Luther said, his voice soft but firm. Marcus didn't stand. He didn't have to. They hadn't needed to speak in years. They had always understood each other in the quiet spaces between words. "Sit down, son," Luther said, his voice carrying a quiet weight. "We need to talk." Marcus felt the familiar pull in his chest, that sense of history, of duty, of purpose. He nodded slowly and stood up, walking toward his father. For all that had changed, some things remained the same. The steady presence of the man who had raised him, the man who had taught him to stand tall, even when the world tried to break him. They sat across from each other, the silence between them thick with unspoken understanding. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that only came after years of walking through battles together, even when those battles had been fought on different fronts. "What's going on, Marcus?" Luther asked, his voice low but filled with a quiet intensity. "I've been following what's happening with Rollins. I know you're in the thick of it. But this isn't just about him, is it?" Marcus met his father's gaze, his own eyes steady, but the weight of the world still pressing on him. "No," he said quietly, "it's never been just about him." Luther nodded, as if he had known that all along. "You've been at this for years. You've seen things, done things that most people can't even imagine. But let me ask you something, Marcus. Is it worth it? All this work, this fight, is it worth it?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure what the right answer was. He had spent so many years focused on the battle, on the mission, that he had never really stopped to ask himself that question. Was it worth it? Was all the pain, all the sacrifice, all the quiet moments of doubt and weariness worth it? "I don't know," he said finally, his voice tinged with a quiet uncertainty. "But I have to believe it is. Because if I don't, then everything I've done, everything I've fought for, has been for nothing." Luther sat back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "And you think this trial, this case, will fix everything?" Marcus shook his head. "No. But it's a start. It's a step in the right direction. And maybe, just maybe, it'll show people that the system isn't invincible. That it can be broken, that it can be fixed." Luther exhaled slowly, the weight of his son's words settling in. "I hope you're right, Marcus, but don't forget, it's not about fixing the system. It's about making sure the people who live under it, the ones it's supposed to protect, never forget their worth. That's what you're fighting for. Not just justice, but the people who deserve it." Marcus nodded slowly, the words settling in like a quiet understanding, a reminder of what it was really all about. Justice wasn't just about laws and trials. It was about people. It was about dignity. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting the office in a golden light that seemed almost too gentle for the conversation happening within it. Marcus, lost in his father's words, couldn't shake the heavy feeling that had settled in his chest. Luther was right, as always. It wasn't just about the trial, or Rollins, or even the case files that weighed down the desk before him. It was about the people, the ones who lived under the weight of a system that was supposed to protect them, but often didn't. The ones who were invisible until they became a symbol, a hashtag, a statistic. Luther, who had lived through decades of struggle, understood the price of justice better than anyone. Marcus had spent his career fighting for it, and yet, at that moment, it felt like it was slipping through his fingers, just out of reach. No matter how many trials he won, no matter how many pieces of evidence he uncovered, it never seemed enough. Luther watched his son, reading the lines of fatigue etched across his face. He didn't need to ask. He could see the toll the work had taken. "You look like a man who's been carrying something too heavy for too long," Luther said, his voice gentle but firm. "But I'll tell you something. Justice is not a prize. It's not something you win or lose. It's something you keep." Marcus looked up at his father, his eyes clear despite the weight he carried. "And what if you never get to see it?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. He hated the vulnerability in his voice, but it was there. The uncertainty, the doubt. Luther leaned forward, the calm presence of his years a steady force in the room. "If you only fought to see it, you'd lose every time. The work doesn't stop because it's done. It keeps going. It's in the small victories, the quiet moments when people know they are seen. That's where the real change starts." Marcus exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He had always believed in the work. He had always believed that change could be forced, that justice could be wrestled from the system. But what his father was saying made him reconsider. Maybe it wasn't about forcing the world into compliance. Maybe it was about giving people the space to see what had always been there. Their worth, their dignity. You know, Luther continued, his voice steady, there was a time when I thought the fight would break me, that it would swallow me whole. But it didn't, it shaped me. And it will shape you too, Marcus. You're not alone in this. Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of his father's wisdom settle in like the slow, steady fall of night. He wasn't alone, not in this fight, not in this journey. He had his father's strength, the quiet resolve that had carried him through decades of struggle. He had the knowledge of those who had come before him, those whose sacrifices had made space for his own. You've done more than most could dream of, Luther said, his voice quiet now, as if speaking the words to himself more than to his son. But the real work is what comes next, the quiet battles, the small moments, the things that don't make headlines. That's where we'll win. The silence in the room grew heavier, more profound. For the first time in a long while, Marcus allowed himself to sit in it, to let the weight of his father's words sink in. He had spent so much of his life pushing, fighting, striving for something that always seemed just out of reach. But now he understood. It wasn't about achieving some grand, final victory. It was about staying in the fight, about holding the line. The truth was there, Marcus realized. It had always been there. And it wasn't a truth that could be bent or broken. It was a truth that lived in the small acts of defiance, in the silent refusals to be complicit, in the resilience of those who refused to be broken, no matter how heavy the world was on their shoulders. The moment stretched on, neither man speaking for a while. They didn't need to. Their understanding was enough. The night had fallen completely now, and with it, a soft peace that settled in the room. It was the kind of peace that could only come after the storm had passed, truth had been spoken. You've done good work, Luther said finally, standing up and walking to the door. But you're not done yet. Marcus stood as well, following his father's movement. No, he agreed, his voice firm now, no trace of doubt lingering. I'm not. As Luther stepped out of the office, he turned back to look at his son, a faint, knowing smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Just remember, son, it's the long game. Always. Marcus nodded, watching his father disappear down the hallway. The old man was right. The work would never stop. It couldn't. There was always more to be done, always more to uncover, always more to fight for. But for the first time, Marcus felt a sense of resolve that had eluded him for so long. He wasn't fighting for recognition or glory. He was fighting for something much more important: the truth and the people who had been silenced by the system for too long. He walked to the window of his office and looked out over the city. The streets were empty now, the city quiet beneath the heavy blanket of night. But within that stillness, he saw the echoes of the battle that was still unfolding. The victory wasn't in the headlines or the trials. It was in the quiet resilience of people like his father. People who had fought for so long, not for themselves, but for others. Justice wasn't about the courtroom. It wasn't about the badge. It was about standing firm, even when the world seemed determined to push you down. And in that moment, Marcus understood what his father had meant. The fight wasn't over, and it never would be. But he was ready for whatever came next. Marcus sat back down at his desk, his hands resting on the surface in front of him. He wasn't thinking about Rawlings anymore, not directly. The trial had gone the way it needed to. The wheels of justice, slow and cumbersome, had started to turn, but Marcus knew that what was coming next would not be easy. In fact, the hardest part was always what came after the verdict. The hard work, the painful truth, was in the aftermath. And that was the part Marcus had learned to navigate in silence. There would be public outcry, sure. There would be calls for reform, for policy changes, for more oversight. There always were. And there would be people like Rawlings, clinging to whatever fragments of power they had left, trying to rewrite their own history. But none of that mattered now. None of it could change what had already been done. No, Marcus wasn't thinking about Rollins anymore. He was thinking about the next case, the next person who would find themselves crushed by a system designed to keep them down. He was thinking about the small injustices that no one saw, the ones that slipped through the cracks. It was there, in the shadows, where the real fight would continue. He took a deep breath, leaning forward as he flicked through the files on his desk. They were all the same. Layers of evidence, stacks of reports, interviews, testimonies, every one of them telling a story of someone who had been hurt by the system. But in these files, there were no heroes, no grand speeches, just the quiet voices of people who had been wronged, and the paper trail of those wrongs. And in that moment, Marcus felt something shift within him. He had been so focused on the fight for so long, so consumed by the notion of winning, that he had forgotten the most important part of the work, the people. Not the case, not the headlines, but the people whose lives had been shattered by the very system that was supposed to protect them. There was a knock at the door, sharp and insistent. Marcus turned, glancing toward it, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. He knew who it was. Leorard stepped into the office, his face set in the same determined expression that had marked their conversations for months now. "The pressure is mounting," he said, his voice low, his eyes flickering with the knowledge that this was just the beginning. "They're already talking about how to handle the aftermath of the trial. They're scrambling, and so is Rollins." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He knew what was coming next. The same dance that always followed a public trial, the attempt to spin the narrative, to find a way to make the system look like it had done its job. But Marcus knew better. He had seen this play before. He had watched the system bend and twist to accommodate the powerful, the corrupt, and the untouchable. "I'm not worried about Rollins," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "Not anymore. He's already lost. What I'm focused on is the people who will come after him, the ones who will continue to be silenced by the system if we don't keep pushing. We need to hold their feet to the fire, Leorard. We can't stop now. We've barely scratched the surface." Leorard's face softened, a rare moment of understanding passing between them. He had always respected Marcus, but in that moment, Marcus could see the weight of the journey that lay ahead. The task ahead wasn't just about one case. It was about the slow, unrelenting march to change, and the fact that, for every victory, there would be 10 more battles waiting. "We'll keep pushing," Leorard said, his voice more resolved than before. "You've got my word on that." Marcus nodded, the weight of the next steps already pressing in on him. "I need to get out there," he said, standing up from his desk. "There's work to do." Leorard stepped aside, allowing Marcus to move past him. They didn't need to speak again. They knew what needed to be done. The work would continue, not with fanfare, but with the quiet precision of a man who understood that real change wasn't about making a spectacle of the fight. It was about the quiet, relentless pursuit of justice, the kind of justice that no one could ignore, because it was too deeply woven into the fabric of the world. Marcus stepped out of his office, the doors closing behind him with a soft click. As he moved down the hallway, his footsteps were steady, purposeful. He wasn't running from anything, but neither was he standing still. There was more to be done, more to uncover, more to expose. The silence had been broken, but it hadn't been silenced. Not yet. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and Marcus stepped inside. His reflection in the shiny surface was a stark reminder of who he had become over the years. Someone who had learned how to fight, but also how to wait, how to let the truth speak when the world was too loud, and how to make sure it was heard. He pressed the button for the ground floor, his mind already on the next step, the next task. He could hear the buzz of voices from the lobby as the doors opened, but he didn't look back. The work was never over. It was just beginning. Outside, the city had come alive in the quiet hours of the night. The streets were lit with the soft glow of streetlights, casting long shadows over the pavement. It felt like the calm before a storm, but Marcus wasn't afraid. He knew what came next. He had known all along. The world would shift, not because of one man's actions, but because of the people who had waited, who had watched, and who had finally started to speak. Marcus walked toward his car, feeling the weight of his father's words settle back into his chest. It wasn't about winning. It was about making sure the system, and the people who had relied on it for protection, were never silenced again. The next few days unfolded slowly, as if time itself had drawn a deep breath, gathering its strength for the coming shift. Marcus found himself at the center of a storm that wasn't about to die down anytime soon. But amidst all the noise, the media frenzy, the public outcry, the endless interviews, he stayed calm, as he always did. His resolve was quiet. He knew that the moment he allowed himself to be swept away by the chaos, truth would be buried beneath it. It was late afternoon when Marcus received the call. The voice on the other end was familiar, one he hadn't heard in a while. The voice of an old colleague, someone he'd worked alongside before, but hadn't seen much of since the case had gained so much attention. It was a woman, strong and steady, her voice holding the weight of experience. "Marcus," she said, her words cutting straight to the point. "We need to talk. There's more here than you think." Marcus felt a ripple of unease stir within him. There were always layers. He had learned that the hard way. The surface never told the full story. The truth he had learned was hidden in the cracks, the places most people refused to look. And when someone called you to tell you there was more, it usually meant the edges of that truth were beginning to show. "Meet me at the usual place," she said. Before the line went dead, Marcus didn't hesitate. He knew exactly where she meant. It was a quiet cafe on the edge of town, the kind of place where you could disappear into the shadows and be left alone. It was where they used to meet when they had a case to discuss that was too dangerous to do in the office, when the stakes were too high to risk being overheard. It was the kind of place where secrets were passed in whispers, and the people who frequented it had long ago learned how to keep their voices steady and their intentions hidden. Marcus arrived just as the sun was setting, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The cafe was almost empty, the soft hum of jazz music filling the air. He spotted her immediately, sitting in the back corner, her hands folded in front of her, her gaze sharp and focused. She looked just as she always had, unassuming, calm, but with the air of someone who had seen too much to ever truly relax. As he sat down across from her, she didn't greet him with the usual pleasantries. She didn't offer a smile. She simply leaned forward, her voice low and steady. "You were right," she said, her eyes flicking toward the door to make sure no one was listening. "Rollins was just a symptom. There's a bigger fish behind all this." Marcus felt a shift in the air. It was as though the weight of the world had just increased, settling on his shoulders with a sharp, cold pressure. He had known it wouldn't be easy. He had known that Rollins wasn't the only one, but to hear it confirmed so bluntly made something inside him tighten. He kept his voice even. "Who?" The woman slid a manila folder across the table, its contents neatly arranged and carefully sealed. "You're going to want to look at this," she said. "This is just the beginning." Marcus opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents inside. They were all related to Rollins, investigations, reports, complaints, and a trail of names that, on the surface, seemed insignificant. But Marcus knew better. Every name had a story, and every story led to something larger, something that would eventually reveal the truth behind the corruption. "What's this?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You thought the system was broken because of one bad cop," she said, leaning in slightly. "Think again. Rollins was protected by a network that goes far beyond the police force. It's in the courts, it's in local government, it's in the agencies that are supposed to oversee everything. This isn't just about one man. This is about a system that's been built to protect people like him." Marcus's breath caught in his chest. His mind was already working, already piecing the puzzle together. The people who had protected Rollins, the ones who had closed cases, suppressed evidence, silenced witnesses. Those were the ones who had created the narrative, who had made sure that the system didn't just fail, but actively helped cover up the truth. The woman continued, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of what she was saying. We've been tracking these connections for months, Marcus, and every thread we pull leads us back to one place. A network of power players who have been playing the same game for years. It's bigger than Rollins, and it's bigger than the police. Marcus felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had always known the system was flawed, but he hadn't known how deep the rot went. The police force was only the surface. The real cancer was in the foundations, in the very institutions that were supposed to protect the people. What do we do now? He asked, his voice a low rumble, as if the weight of the truth was too much for him to carry. The woman sat back, her eyes narrowing. We go public. We can't let them bury this. But we do it carefully, Marcus. One wrong move, and they'll crush us before we can even get a word out. We need to expose this, but we have to have all our ducks in a row first. Marcus nodded slowly, his mind racing. He knew what they were up against. He knew that exposing this corruption wouldn't just be dangerous. It would be a war. A war that could cost him everything. His career, his reputation, his peace. But it was a war he was already in. Whether he liked it or not. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on the woman's. We'll do it. We'll expose it. We'll go after them. All of them. The woman's eyes held his for a moment longer, a silent understanding passing between them. They both knew the stakes. They both knew that this wasn't just about one man's fall from grace. This was about the beginning of something much larger. A reckoning that would shake the very foundation of the system they had once believed in. And so they began. They worked in the shadows, gathering evidence, tracking leads, and making sure they were prepared. It wasn't just about getting the truth out. It was about making sure that when it was exposed, it would be undeniable. It would be a force too powerful to ignore. Marcus's world had shifted. He had stepped into a war, not one he had chosen, but one that had chosen him. And now there was no turning back. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity, each day blending into the next as Marcus and the woman, whose name was Evelyn, though Marcus hadn't had the chance to ask her much about herself, yet dove deeper into the labyrinth of corruption they had uncovered. Every document, every file they uncovered felt like peeling back another layer of a long-forgotten wound, and with every layer the smell of rot grew stronger. It wasn't just the connections to Rollins that troubled Marcus, it was what they had discovered beyond him. The deeper they dug, the more they found that the same patterns existed across multiple jurisdictions, across agencies that were supposed to oversee, protect, and ensure accountability. Everywhere they looked, they found a familiar story, a network of power that went unchecked, of men and women who wore badges and wielded power with impunity. And those who had the courage to speak out? They were silenced, either by fear or by force. Marcus spent countless nights at his desk, staring at the screen in front of him, piecing together the data. It was like trying to assemble a puzzle where the pieces were always moving, constantly being erased or altered. He began to see the threads, the connections between the judges, the officers, the political figures who were part of this hidden world. They thought they were untouchable, and for years they had been. But Marcus knew that it was time to change that. Evelyn had her own sources, her own network of informants who had risked everything to come forward. Some of them were retired officers, others still in the game, but all of them had witnessed the same thing, a culture of corruption that had been allowed to fester for decades, with no one to challenge it. One evening, as Marcus sat at his desk reviewing more documents, his phone buzzed. It was Evelyn. "Marcus, we've got a leak," she said, her voice tense. It's bigger than we thought. There's a judge involved, one who's been covering for Rollins and the others. We need to move quickly. This could be the breaking point we need." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He had suspected that the judicial system was involved, but hearing it confirmed, hearing that someone so high up had been complicit, made the stakes feel even more real. "Who?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. "Elliot Sanders," she replied. "He's been involved in a number of cases that have been swept under the rug, including Rollins. He's been part of the machine for years, and if we don't move on this now, we'll lose our chance." Marcus stood up, his mind already racing. Sanders was a name he had seen before, but it had never quite clicked into place. Now it did. The judge had been at the center of several high-profile cases, always ensuring that the charges were dropped, the evidence dismissed, or the witnesses silenced. He had been operating under the radar for far too long, and now the web of corruption that he had helped protect was beginning to unravel. "We'll need everything," Marcus said. "Every piece of information, every connection, every file. If we go after Sanders, we go after everything." Evelyn was silent for a moment, the weight of what she was about to say hanging in the air. "I've got someone inside," she said quietly. "Someone who can get us the information we need. But it's risky. Sanders has eyes everywhere. If we make one wrong move, we'll be exposed before we can do anything." Marcus's mind was already calculating the risks. He knew the danger of exposing someone like Sanders. A man like him wouldn't go down without a fight, and he would use every tool at his disposal to protect himself. But Marcus had already made up his mind. This was the moment they had been waiting for. It was time to take the fight directly to the people who thought they were untouchable. "Do it," Marcus said firmly. "Get me everything. We move on Sanders now." The next few days were a blur of urgency. Evelyn's informant came through with more information than they had expected, and what they found only confirmed Marcus's worst fears. Sanders wasn't just a rogue judge. He was part of a much larger network that had been systematically manipulating the system for years. His ties to Rollins and others in law enforcement were undeniable, and the pattern of cover-ups extended far beyond what Marcus had initially imagined. As they sifted through the evidence, Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of the task ahead of them. This wasn't just about taking down one man. This was about exposing an entire system of corruption, a system that had been allowed to operate unchecked for far too long. The work they were doing would have far-reaching consequences, and Marcus knew that if they failed, the repercussions would be catastrophic, not just for them, but for everyone who had ever trusted the system to protect them. The closer they got to Sanders, the more dangerous the situation became. Marcus's every move felt like it was being watched. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. They had to be precise, they had to be careful, and most of all, they had to be patient. On the night they finally gathered enough evidence to make their move, Marcus stood at his window, looking out over the city. It was quiet, the streets empty, the lights of the city casting long shadows across the pavement. He felt the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on him, but he didn't falter. This was the right thing to do, the only thing to do. "Are you ready?" Evelyn asked, her voice crackling through the phone. Marcus took a deep breath, his mind steady. The night air was thick with anticipation, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm, heavy and suffocating. Marcus's eyes remained fixed on the city below, watching the faint lights of passing cars, the glow of street lamps that painted the streets in fractured hues. Everything seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something that neither time nor the human eye could truly predict. And yet Marcus knew exactly what was coming next. He had known since he had first walked into the courtroom, since the moment his father's blood had been spilled, not just on his glasses, but on the very heart of the system that had turned a blind eye for so long. Now it was his turn to make sure that blood did not go unnoticed, that the justice his father had always trusted in would be more than just a word. Evelyn's voice broke through the silence, sharp and clear. "We've got it, Marcus. The judge's ties, the paper trail, it's all here. We can move now." He didn't hesitate. The time for waiting was over. He had learned long ago that in moments like this, hesitation was the enemy. Marcus's thoughts were already clear, already aligned with the task at hand. The paper trail had led them here, to a pivotal moment, but what they had in their hands now would be the spark. The plan was simple, methodical. There was no room for errors. To expose Sanders, to take down the men and women who had orchestrated this system of corruption for decades. But what they needed was the right leverage, the right push. There had to be no turning back. Marcus didn't waste another second. He hung up the phone, taking a long, steadying breath before grabbing his coat from the back of his chair. Each step he took felt heavier, yet purposeful. In the silence that enveloped him, there was only the weight of the mission. There were no cheers, no accolades. The quiet resolve to move forward. He met Evelyn outside, standing by her car in the shadow of a building that seemed to consume the light around it. She was already in motion, already heading toward the car when she noticed Marcus. She didn't greet him with words. Instead, she simply handed him an envelope. Inside it was all there, names, locations, connections. It was the first thread in unraveling the entire web, and Marcus knew that with it, they could finally start bringing the truth to light. "You're sure about this?" Evelyn asked, her voice low but with a hint of something that might have been fear. Or maybe it was just weariness. Weariness from years of playing the long game, from sitting in the shadows, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment. Marcus looked at her, his expression unreadable. "We don't have time to doubt now. We're already too deep. We take the shot, or we wait for them to come for us." Evelyn nodded, and without another word they got into the car. It wasn't just a mission now, it was survival. And survival, as they both knew too well, came down to timing and precision. As the car moved through the empty streets, Marcus's mind was already on the task ahead. He could feel the weight of it in his chest. How much of what he had believed in was about to be exposed, about to be torn apart. The system he had sworn to protect, the very institutions he had once trusted, were about to be revealed as the house of cards they had always been. And he wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting for something far bigger than that. The car stopped in front of a nondescript building, the kind that on any other night would have gone unnoticed. But tonight, it was the center of everything. It was here that they would begin to lay bare the truths they had spent months uncovering. Marcus took one last look at Evelyn before stepping out of the car, the chill of the night air seeping into his bones. They walked in silence through the back door of the building, their footsteps echoing in the hollow space. The room they entered was dimly lit, and it smelled of dust and old furniture. It was an archive room, stacked high with files and boxes of paperwork. Everything had been meticulously kept organized. It was in these files, these dusty corners, where the real story lay buried. "Where do we start?" Evelyn asked, her voice just above a whisper. She looked at Marcus, but he didn't answer right away. He walked toward a shelf in the back of the room, one that was just slightly askew, as though it had been moved recently. Reaching up, he pulled a thick file from the top shelf. He didn't need to read the label. He knew exactly what it was. It was a list of names, witnesses, victims, bystanders, and in the margins the same names that had been buried, erased, or ignored. As Marcus flipped through the file, his eyes scanning the pages, the weight of the truth began to settle deeper into his chest. This was it. This was the evidence they needed to expose Sanders, and by extension, the entire network of corruption that had protected men like Rollins for so long. "Are you ready?" Evelyn asked again, her voice barely audible. Marcus didn't respond at first. He was already thinking several steps ahead, planning how they would release this information, how they would expose the truth without being swallowed whole by the system that had spent so many years perfecting the art of silence. "Let's move," he said finally, his voice calm but carrying the weight of everything they had uncovered. He handed the file to Evelyn. "We can't wait any longer. This goes out tonight." They spent the next several hours meticulously preparing the evidence, making sure that everything was in place. They knew what was at stake, but they also knew they couldn't go back. Not after everything they had seen, everything they had learned. And as the first rays of the morning sun began to creep through the blinds of the small, dimly lit room, Marcus and Evelyn made their final preparations. The truth was out there, ready to be exposed. And once it was, there would be no going back. The world would change. It had to. Marcus turned to Evelyn as they prepared to send the information to the press, the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Once this goes public, we have to be ready for everything. There will be no hiding, no pretending it didn't happen. The system will fight back, but we won't stop. Evelyn met his gaze, her eyes steely with resolve. "We've come this far, Marcus. We're not stopping now." And with that, they hit send. The morning sun broke through the blinds, casting its first tentative rays across the floor, illuminating the dust motes that danced lazily in the quiet room. But for Marcus and Evelyn, there was no peace in the light of day. The world outside was about to erupt, and they were right at the center of it. As they sat in the stillness of the small office, the weight of what they had just done hung in the air like a thick fog, oppressive and heavy. The clock on the wall ticked louder now, every second stretching longer, every breath drawn with anticipation. It had begun. The information had been sent. The truth was about to be unveiled to the world, and there would be no turning back. Marcus glanced at Evelyn, his eyes steady, but his mind was already working, calculating the steps ahead. "It's done," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of everything they had just exposed. "Now we wait." Evelyn's fingers drummed against the table, the rhythm of her thoughts matching the ticking of the clock. "No, we don't wait. We move. We stay ahead of this. We need to make sure the fallout doesn't swallow us whole." Marcus nodded. She was right. The press would take the story and twist it. The public would demand answers, and the system would fight back. It wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about making sure it stayed exposed, that it couldn't be buried again. There would be no headlines glorifying them, no awards for their work. There would only be the hard, cold reality of their choices. The phone rang. Evelyn picked it up without hesitation, her fingers brushing the receiver as though it were a lifeline. She listened for a moment, her face shifting from calm to something colder, something harder. She hung up, her eyes narrowing. "We have company," she said quietly. It started. Marcus didn't ask who. He knew the answer. It was inevitable. The network they had exposed wouldn't go down without a fight. It had never been about justice for them. It had been about control, and now that control was slipping from their grasp. "We need to leave," Evelyn said, already moving toward the door. Now the urgency in her voice pushed Marcus into motion. He didn't question. He didn't look back. He grabbed his coat, stepped out into the hallway, and followed her to the back exit of the building. They had planned for this moment, but planning could only take you so far. Now, they had to act with the precision of soldiers going into battle, but without the luxury of time. The city was still waking up, its streets bathed in the cold light of early morning. People bustled around, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. The calm before the storm, Marcus thought, watching the way the city moved, completely oblivious to the truth that had just been released. The peace of their morning was, as they walked quickly down the alley, Marcus felt the weight of their decisions settling on him once again. He had known this would happen. He had known the backlash would come, but it wasn't fear he felt. It was something else, something like resolve. The world wasn't going to change because of one expose, one file. But maybe, just maybe, it could change because they had taken the first step to break it open. They had made the system feel the sting of accountability, something it hadn't known in decades. They reached a nondescript black sedan, parked at the curb. Without a word, they climbed in, and the car roared to life, blending into the flow of traffic as though it belonged there. Marcus stared out the window, his thoughts consumed by what had just transpired. It had started, and now they had to see it through, no matter the cost. Evelyn spoke again, her voice low. "This is only the beginning. The media's already got hold of it, and once they start digging, there will be no stopping it. We can't afford to get complacent." Marcus didn't need to hear more. He had been through this before, many times over. The moment a story broke, the media would feast on it, twist it, shape it into whatever narrative served the highest bidder. They weren't the story, the truth was, and they couldn't afford to let it be overshadowed by the noise. He turned his attention back to the road ahead. This was the part of the journey that mattered the most. They had done the hardest work. Now they had to make sure the system didn't crush the light they had just shined on it. The car sped through the streets, but Marcus's mind was far from the city outside. It was in the courtroom, it was with his father, and it was with all the people who had ever been silenced by this system. It was with the children who had written letters like the one he had found in his father's home, the ones who believed that they could be like him, that they could make a difference. "Do you think it will work?" Evelyn asked, pulling Marcus from his thoughts. He turned to her, his expression steady, his voice calm. "It has to." They drove for what felt like hours, crossing into areas of the city where the shadows grew longer, the buildings taller. There were no streets they could hide on anymore. They had exposed too much for anyone to simply look away. Eventually, the car stopped at a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place that was as anonymous as the work they had been doing. Inside, there was no fanfare, no ceremony, only a few trusted people who had been waiting for this moment as long as Marcus had. They all knew what was at stake. As they entered the warehouse, Marcus scanned the room. Every face he saw was one of resolve. No one looked fearful. They looked prepared. One of the men, a tall figure with an unshaven face and tired eyes, nodded at Marcus. "You did it! It's all over the news. People are already talking." Marcus nodded, his eyes narrowing. "This is just the beginning. We need to make sure it doesn't get buried, that it doesn't get twisted into something else." Another man, older with silver hair and a deep, steady voice, spoke. "We'll make sure it gets out. The truth has to stay alive, no matter what." Marcus nodded again, his fingers tapping against the metal table. The weight of the world was beginning to settle on him, but he didn't flinch. He couldn't. This wasn't about him. This was about making sure the truth didn't get lost, about making sure the men like Rollins and Sanders and all the others didn't walk away, their crimes unpunished. It was time to act, time to finish what they had started. The following days felt like walking through a haze, a blur of press conferences, leaked stories, and the ceaseless hum of the media machines churning out reports faster than anyone could process them. Marcus sat at his desk in the dim light of his apartment, eyes glued to the screen, following the unfolding chaos with a careful detachment. His mind, however, was focused elsewhere, on the next move, on how to ensure that the truth would continue to ripple outward. Checked. The world had erupted, yes. The footage, the files, the documents, they were all out there now. Social media had exploded, and hashtags demanding accountability spread faster than wildfire. From the streets to the highest echelons of power, people were talking, pointing fingers, and asking questions. But Marcus knew that the real battle wasn't in the media. It was in the dark corridors of power. The ones who had been comfortable in their seats for so long were now shifting uncomfortably. But the truth was a dangerous thing. No one wanted to let it in too far. And then, just as he had predicted, the blowback started. The forces that had spent years covering up their deeds now found themselves on the defensive, scrambling to protect their own. The media frenzy would only take them so far, and Marcus knew that the real pressure, the real fight, would come in the boardrooms, the back rooms of the judiciary, the offices of power. The men who had profited from the status quo would not go down quietly. Evelyn had been busy, too, contacting her own network of allies, people who had risked everything to come forward. She was making sure that the leaks stayed steady, that the pieces of the puzzle kept flowing into the public eye. But even she couldn't hide the growing tension that was palpable in the air. The system had started to stir slowly, but with a power that could easily crush anything that wasn't protected. Marcus knew that the system had to be restructured, not simply overthrown. It had to be dismantled piece by piece, but carefully, with precision. Otherwise, it would simply rebuild itself, stronger and more entrenched than before. As he prepared for what was to come, Marcus received a call late one night. The voice on the other end was familiar, but the words that followed were not. "Marcus, we need you here. It's bigger than we thought. They're pushing back harder now, but there's something you don't know." And critical. It was the voice of his contact in Washington, someone who had always been in the background, working on the other side of the aisle. He was a man who knew the system, knew how it worked, and was part of the very infrastructure Marcus was trying to expose. "Tell me," Marcus replied, his voice steady, his mind already calculating. "We've been getting pressure from all sides. It's not just about the Rollins case anymore. It's about Sanders and the other names we've uncovered. They're circling back, cleaning up their tracks, and they've got people in the agency who are trying to bury everything we've worked on." Marcus felt the air around him go still. He had been waiting for this moment, but it didn't make the wait any easier to carry. The storm was no longer distant. It was here, right in front of him. "Do you have proof?" he asked. "I can't say over the phone," the voice said, urgency lacing his words, "but we need to meet tomorrow." "You know the place," Marcus nodded, although he knew the man couldn't see him. "I'll be there. Don't move. We're in this together now." The next morning, Marcus found himself on the move again. He left early, before the city had truly stirred, and met Evelyn along the way. They drove in silence, the weight of their next steps heavy between them. There was no time for preparation, no time to strategize. This was a fight for survival. It wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about preserving everything they had exposed and making sure it didn't get wiped away in a single sweep of a bureaucrat's hand. When they arrived at the location, a nondescript coffee shop nestled between two run-down buildings, Marcus could already see the tension in the air. The man he had been meeting with for months was sitting at the far end, watching the door with careful eyes. He nodded as Marcus approached. "You've seen it," Marcus said, not bothering with pleasantries. The man took a deep breath and slid a folder across the table. "It's worse than we thought. These names? They're more than just a trail. They're connected to people at the highest levels of government, senators, governors, even someone from the White House. This is a clean-up operation, and they're using every resource they have to make it disappear." Marcus picked up the folder and opened it, his mind racing as he skimmed through the pages. There, in black and white, was the evidence they needed. The names, the connections, the way the system had been manipulated for years, how it had turned into a self-sustaining engine of corruption. And at the top of it all was a network of people who thought they were untouchable. Evelyn leaned over his shoulder, scanning the documents. "We can't let this go. If we expose this, it's not just about Rollins anymore. It's about the entire foundation of the system. It'll fall apart." Marcus didn't respond immediately. His mind was already piecing together the next step. They were getting too close to the heart of it now, and he knew that this was the most dangerous part of the game. The closer they got, the harder it would be to keep their heads above water. "We need to act fast," Marcus said, pushing the folder back toward the man. "Get this out. Connection, every name. They'll try to bury it, but we need to make sure it stays in the light." "I'll get it to the press," the man replied, his voice quiet but determined. "But be ready. They're going to come after you, after all of us. You've kicked the hornet's nest." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Then we stand firm. We don't give an inch." As they left the coffee shop and moved back into the car, Marcus's thoughts swirled in a haze. He had always known that this moment would come. He had prepared for it in his mind, in the quiet hours of sleepless nights. But now that it was here, the reality of what they had set in motion was almost too much to bear. The final pieces were falling into place, but Marcus couldn't help but wonder, would it be enough? Would the truth be enough to topple this giant, or had they merely created a spark that would be snuffed out before it could catch fire? The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. No matter what happened, Marcus Rowe would not stop. The truth, no matter how dangerous it was, would be seen. The air was electric as Marcus and Evelyn sped toward their next destination, the hum of the car's engine barely audible over the storm of thoughts racing through his mind. They had crossed a threshold, stepped into space where the lines between right and wrong were no longer clear, where the enemy was no longer just an individual, but an entire structure, an entire system built on exploitation, manipulation, and lies. It had started with Rollins, yes, but now it was so much bigger. Every name they had uncovered in the files, every connection they had traced, led to something far more insidious than a single rogue officer. It was a network, a machine operating behind the scenes, its gears turning in secrecy, its power consolidated and protected by those who had the means to bury the truth as easily as they had protected the corrupt men in uniform. They drove in silence for a while, the city around them blending into a blur of cold concrete and steel. Marcus's thoughts drifted back to the courthouse, to the moment when his father had stood tall, silent, and unyielding in the face of violence. That was the lesson Luther Rowe had taught him, without ever saying a word, that the greatest form of resistance was not shouting or striking, but simply standing firm when the world tried to make you bend. But now, Marcus understood something deeper. The world might bend a man, but it couldn't break him unless he allowed it. The system, built on centuries of power and control, was ready to break under its own weight. It wasn't just about the criminal actions of one officer or one corrupt politician. It was about the corruption of the entire system, the structures that propped up those who had lived off the suffering of others. "You know," Evelyn said quietly, breaking the silence between them, This is what they were afraid of. They never thought you'd actually expose it. They thought you'd play their game." Marcus didn't reply immediately. His fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly as he maneuvered the car through the winding streets. His mind was already 10 steps ahead, planning what came next. "They never thought they would have to answer for what they've done," he said, his voice low, measured. "They thought the world would keep looking the other way. They thought the truth was a luxury for people like us, who could afford to ask for it." A flicker of recognition crossed Evelyn's face, and she nodded. "But you've been playing by their rules all along. You just made them forget that they aren't the only ones who know how to wield power." Marcus didn't smile. He didn't need to. Evelyn was right. He had spent his entire life following the rules, working within the system, believing in the law. But it was moments like these, when the law was weaponized, twisted into something it was never meant to be, that he knew the rules had to change. The law was supposed to protect, not punish. It was supposed to stand as a wall against corruption, not serve as its shield. And now, with the evidence they had uncovered, Marcus was about to tear down that wall. He knew that what they were doing was dangerous, but he also knew that it was the only way forward. If they let this moment pass, if they allowed the system to silence them once again, then the entire fight would have been for nothing. The car slowed as they reached a nondescript office building at the edge of the city. It was one of the few remaining safe houses they had access to, a place that had been used in the past for discreet meetings, away from prying eyes. The building was unremarkable, but to Marcus, it represented something far more significant. It was their final staging ground, the place where they would make their move, where they would ensure that the truth didn't just slip back into the darkness. He parked the car and turned off the engine. The silence in the car was different. Now, it wasn't the stillness of waiting, it was the stillness before an explosion, the calm before the storm. They stepped out of the car, the cold wind biting at their skin, as they made their way into the building. Inside, it was a different world. Quiet, dimly lit, the walls lined with filing cabinets and dusty shelves. There were a few others here, people who had been in the shadows for too long, people who knew how to navigate the undercurrents of power without being noticed. One of them, a tall woman with dark eyes and an air of quiet confidence, met them at the door. "It's all set," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "We have everything we need. The press is starting to catch wind of the leaks, and they're asking questions. The politicians, too. They'll be forced to respond soon." Marcus nodded, his expression hardening. "Good. Let's make sure they don't have time to cover it up." The woman handed him a flash drive, a simple, unassuming piece of technology that carried within it the weight of their findings. The names, the connections, the documents that tied everything. It was more than just evidence. It was the key to bringing down the entire structure, to exposing the rot from within. And now, with the press on their tail and the truth out in the open, they had the power to make sure it couldn't be buried again. Evelyn took the drive from Marcus's hand, her fingers lingering for a moment as their eyes met. "This is it," she said quietly. "The final step, everything we've worked for, everything your father worked for." Marcus's eyes softened for just a moment, but then the weight of the task ahead settled back into place. "It's not about what we've worked for, it's about what needs to be done. We have to make sure it sticks." He turned and made his way to a nearby terminal, typing in the necessary commands to upload the files. Every keystroke felt like a small victory, a victory for every person who had ever been silenced, for every victim who had never been heard. It was their turn now. The truth would be out, and it wouldn't be stopped. The files uploaded with a soft ping, and Marcus leaned back in his chair, his fingers trembling slightly from the weight of everything that had happened. This was the moment they had fought for, the moment they had bled for. And yet, as the files began to circulate, as the first reports were filed, the world outside continued on, unaware that the tides had started to turn. As Marcus sat there, waiting for the inevitable storm to hit, he knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, he would not back down. The system had tried to break his father. It had tried to break him, but it had failed. And now, the truth would come for them all. The storm hit faster than anyone. In the blink of an eye, the firestorm of media attention erupted, and the world's gaze snapped to the once quiet documents Marcus had so carefully pieced together. They came in waves, these waves of chaos, crashing against the very foundation of the system that had been built to protect its own. The press, for all its flaws, had done one thing right. They had found the cracks, and they had hammered at them until they gave way. It wasn't just the footage of Rollins anymore. It was the entire network, the very fabric of a system that had long been built on abuse and silence, now exposed for the world to see. The press conferences, the interviews, the police and political figures scrambling for control, none of it could hide the truth. The dam had broken. What was once hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and complacency was now laid bare. Rot. As Marcus sat in his apartment, the weight of it all pressed down on him, heavier than any burden he'd ever felt. He was no longer just an agent, no longer simply a part of the machine. He had become a symbol, though it wasn't one he had sought. The files, the leaks, the truth, it had turned him into something else entirely. His phone buzzed once, twice, but he didn't pick it up. Evelyn's calls, the press reaching out for comments, they were all distractions now. None of it mattered. He had done what needed to be done. His job was never to be a symbol. It was to create a crack in the system that could never heal. He had done that. Now it was time for the fallout to play out, but there were no easy victories here. No heroes. The truth had always been a weapon, But now that it was in the hands of the public, the danger it posed was no longer just to the guilty. It would tear at the very fabric of the institutions meant to uphold it. And in the destruction, there would be casualties. People would fall, the system would shift, but it would not simply crumble under the weight of its own lies. It would adapt, it would fight back, and Marcus was prepared for that. He glanced at the photos on the wall, the pictures of his father in the quiet moments of his life, of the man who had taught him that dignity didn't come from power. It came from standing firm in the face of adversity. Luther Rowe had never once needed validation. His truth had always been enough. And now it was Marcus's turn to stand tall, not for applause, not for recognition, but for the memory of every person who had been swept under the rug by the system that had failed them. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It wasn't a polite knock, a courteous request for entry. It was the kind of knock that reverberated in his bones, the kind that said things were about to change again. Without hesitation, Marcus rose from his seat and opened the door. Standing in the doorway was a figure he had not expected, his colleague from Washington, a man who had been part of the machine he had tried so hard to break. "You're not answering your phone," the man said, his voice measured but urgent. "We've got a situation." Marcus stepped aside, allowing him into the room. His eyes never left the man's face, studying every shift, every subtle hint of anxiety. Something was wrong. "The fallout's happening faster than we anticipated," the man continued, his voice lower now. "The senators are moving. They've already begun coordinating damage control. They're pressuring our allies in the Bureau, trying to contain the leaks." Marcus felt the pressure of those words, but he didn't flinch. This was the fight he had expected. He had known it was coming. He had known they wouldn't let the truth stand without a fight. "Have you spoken to the press?" Marcus asked, his voice steady. "Not yet," the man replied, "but they'll be coming for you. The media is calling you a whistleblower, a hero, the human who broke the system. It's not just about Rollins anymore. They're coming after anyone who helped bring this to light." Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for his jacket, his fingers brushing against the collar. He wasn't just an agent anymore. He was a target. The same system that had propped up people like Rollins for years would not let him simply walk away. "Get the press out of this," Marcus said finally. "Focus on what's real. Focus on the truth. Everything we've done is out there. We don't need to play their game." The man hesitated, his brow furrowing slightly. "Marcus, we can't just ignore the public. We're in too deep. If we don't act now, if we don't get ahead of this—" "I've already done what I came to do," Marcus cut him off, his voice sharp but calm. "The rest is noise." The man seemed to recognize the finality in Marcus's tone, his posture shifting slightly. He understood now that Marcus wasn't just concerned with the politics, with the media frenzy, with any of the noise. He wasn't even concerned with his own future. He had done his part. The rest, as far as Marcus was concerned, was beyond his control. "Fine," the man said, stepping back toward the door. "But you need to be ready. There are people who won't forget what you've done. And when they come for you, they'll come hard." Marcus nodded, his gaze steady. "Let them come. I'll be ready." The man turned, disappearing into the hallway, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts once again. The world outside was changing. It was too late to stop it. The truth had already been set loose. And now all they could do was ride the storm. As the door clicked shut, Marcus looked toward the window. The sky was darker now, the clouds thick and heavy with rain. The storm was gathering, but Marcus was no longer afraid of it. The storm was his ally now. He had built it, he had made it, and now it was time to watch it unfold. The truth had begun to spread, and nothing, not a single force in the world, could stop it. Marcus crossed the room, his footsteps deliberate, each one echoing the resolve that had carried him this far. The knocking persisted, sharp and insistent, cutting through the quiet hum of the city outside his window. He paused at the door, his hand hovering over the handle, his mind racing through possibilities. Friend? Foe? Ally turned adversary? In his line of work, trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. He opened the door, revealing a figure cloaked in shadow, their face partially obscured by the dim hallway light. It was Elena, one of the whistleblowers who had come forward with the initial evidence. Her presence here, at this hour, sent a jolt through him. Her eyes were wide, her breath uneven, as if she'd been running. "Marcus," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "We don't have much time." He stepped aside, letting her in, and closed the door quickly. The room felt smaller now, the air thick with the weight of what she might say. Elena clutched a small, worn notebook, its edges frayed from use. She set it on the desk, her hands trembling slightly. "They know," she said, her voice low but steady. "They've been tracking everyone who spoke out. The files you released. They're trying to bury them, but it's worse than that. They're rewriting the narrative. They're planting false evidence to discredit us." Marcus's eyes narrowed. He'd anticipated pushback, but this was bolder than he'd expected. The system wasn't just defending itself, it was rewriting history to erase their efforts. He picked up the notebook, flipping through pages filled with hurried notes, dates, and names. Some familiar, others new. A network of corruption, deeper than he'd realized, sprawling like roots beneath the surface. "How did you get this?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with urgency. "I've been digging," Elena said. "After you released the first set of documents, I kept looking. There's a shadow group, people in high places, not just in the Bureau but beyond it. They're orchestrating this. They've been watching you, Marcus. They know every move you've made. He set the notebook down, his mind already piecing together the next steps. The system was vast, but it wasn't invincible. Every machine had its weak points, and he'd already found one. The truth, once it was out, couldn't be fully contained. It spread like wildfire, carried by the people who had been silenced for too long. "What do they want?" Marcus asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Control," Elena said simply. "They want to scare us into silence. They're targeting you first because you're the face of this. But it's not just you, it's all of us, everyone who spoke out, everyone who believed in the truth." Marcus leaned against the desk, his gaze drifting to the files spread out before him. Each page was a testament to the courage of those who had risked everything. He wasn't alone in this fight, and that knowledge steadied him. The system could try to rewrite the story, but it couldn't erase the voices of those who carried it. Then we don't stop," Marcus said, his voice resolute. "We double down. We release everything, every name, every transaction, every lie. If they want a fight, we give them one they can't win." Elena nodded, a spark of determination in her eyes. "There's a safe house," she said. "A place where we can regroup, plan our next move. Others are already there. Whistleblowers, allies, people who believe in what we're doing. But we have to move fast. They're closing in." Marcus grabbed the notebook and a handful of files, tucking them into a satchel. The weight of the truth was heavy, but it was a burden he was willing to carry. He glanced at Elena, her face set with the same resolve he felt. They were in this together, a small but growing force against a machine that thrived on secrecy. "Let's go," he said, opening the door and stepping into the night. The storm was still brewing, but now it wasn't just creeping. It was roaring, and Marcus was ready to ride it. Opening the door, he found himself face to face with the woman who had stood beside him throughout the investigation. Her face was serious, her eyes filled with something deeper than just concern. There was fear there, too, a kind of raw, primal fear that spoke of things she had seen, but never spoken about. "Marcus," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "it's happening. The meeting. It's tomorrow." Marcus nodded, not surprised. "I know. I've already been told. They want you to back down," she continued, her hands shaking slightly as she spoke. "They're offering you a way out. But you can't take it, Marcus. You can't give them that power." "I won't," he said firmly, his gaze unwavering. "This isn't about power. This is about the truth. The system is broken, and I'm going to make sure it stays broken." She nodded, her eyes flickering with a mix of admiration and something else. Fear? Fear for him? He couldn't tell, but it didn't matter. She understood. They all understood. This wasn't about saving themselves anymore. This was about saving what little was left of a system that had been rotting from the inside for years. The silence between them stretched for a moment, but it wasn't an uncomfortable one. It was a moment of understanding, of solidarity. They were in this together, and together they had exposed the cracks in the facade. Now they had to see it through to the end. Marcus looked her square in the eyes. "It's not over yet. We still have work to do." She nodded, her lips pressed tight. "We won't stop. Not now. Not ever." As she turned to leave, Marcus watched her go, the door clicking softly behind her. The weight of what was to come hung in the air like a thick fog, but he didn't feel the usual anxiety that accompanied such moments. Instead, he felt a strange sense of calm. The battle had already been fought, and the truth had already been laid bare. Now it was just a matter of watching the pieces fall. The rest of the world might still be spinning, might still be caught in the chaos of the fallout, but Marcus Rowe was no longer playing by their rules. He had rewritten the story, and now it was time to let the truth run its course. The morning of the meeting arrived, sharp and relentless, just like everything that had led up to it. The sky was a pale, muted gray, a prelude to the storm that would soon stir within the walls of the conference room. Marcus didn't need to look out the window to know the tension outside mirrored the one that had been tightening around him for days. The world from the outside was beginning to crack open, and the fissures were spreading faster than anyone could comprehend. He had not slept well. His mind had refused to quiet, kept alive by the growing pressure and the knowledge that the next few hours would determine everything. The last remnants of his privacy, of his normal life, had been stripped away. His name was out there, his actions being dissected and discussed by millions, but the worst part wasn't the press or the pressure. It was the cold certainty that the system was coming for him now, and they would stop at nothing to put him in his place. But Marcus had never been someone who could be placed. Not anymore. He got dressed in silence, the click of his shoes against the wood floor, the only sound breaking through the quiet. He looked in the mirror, his reflection steady, unwavering. There was no fear in his eyes, not now. No anxiety, only a kind of calm that came from knowing exactly what he had to do. The knock came at the door, sharp and insistent, the sound that had become so familiar. Evelyn's voice followed, muffled but clear through the door. "It's time." Marcus nodded once, taking one last look at his reflection before heading toward the door. A beat in a steady rhythm, a heartbeat that kept him grounded, even as the weight of everything hung above him like a sword. The drive to the meeting was uneventful, the city outside still shrouded in that same gray, as though the weather itself was waiting, holding its breath for whatever would happen inside the building. The car moved with a quiet urgency, weaving through streets that had long ceased to be anything more than a backdrop to the drama unfolding within them. Marcus sat in silence, the events of the past few weeks playing like an endless loop in his mind. He had done what no one else had dared do. He had exposed them. And now the fallout was inevitable. When they arrived, Marcus stepped out of the car and walked into the building with purpose, shoulders squared and his eyes focused. He didn't look up at the cameras, the flashing lights, or the reporters waiting outside. There was nothing to prove to them. There was no need for speeches or grand gestures. All he needed to do now was walk through the doors and face what came next. Inside, the room was cold, its sterile walls reflecting the muted tension that filled the air. People were already gathered, officials from every corner of the system Marcus had worked within. There were no allies here, not anymore. Just those who were trying to protect their own positions, their own futures. the ones who would sell anyone out to maintain their hold on power. The door behind him closed with a soft thud, and the silence that followed felt as heavy as stone. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, could feel the judgment hanging in the air. But Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't look away. The truth was on his side, and that truth was more powerful than any of the threats these men could wield. The meeting began almost immediately, the voices of the men in suits filling the room with a familiar, suffocating tone. They spoke of procedures, of public relations strategies, of how to contain the damage. But it wasn't just about Rollins anymore. It was about him, about what he had done and how it had shaken the very foundations of the system they had all worked to protect. One of the senior officials, a man whose name Marcus had long since stopped caring about, spoke up, his voice clipped and cold. "Agent Rowe," he began, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at Marcus, "we're grateful for your work. Truly we are. But you've gone too far." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He wasn't here to make small talk. He wasn't here to listen to their half-hearted gratitude. He was here to do one thing, to make sure the truth stayed in the light, no matter what it cost him. "You exposed corruption, yes," the official continued, his tone now turning almost condescending. "But you've done so in a way that risks everything we've built. You've jeopardized the integrity of this institution, of the very system we're supposed to protect." At those words, something inside Marcus shifted. He had heard this argument before, from different faces, in different forms, but it always came down to the same thing: protecting the institution, the system that had allowed men like Rollins to thrive. "And what about the people you're supposed to protect?" Marcus finally asked, his voice calm but tinged with an edge of anger. "What about the truth? The victims? You're so concerned with the integrity of this institution. But what about the integrity of the lives you've destroyed? What about the families, the people who've been trampled by the very system you claim to protect?" The room fell silent at his words, the weight of his question hanging in the air. No one responded. No one could. "This isn't about protecting the system," Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength. "This is about holding people accountable for the harm they've caused. And if that means taking down the entire system, then so be it. You don't get to hide behind bureaucracy anymore." The senior official's face reddened, but Marcus didn't care. He had no patience for these people anymore. They were part of the problem, and he wasn't going to stand by while they tried to minimize the damage they had caused. "We're prepared to offer you a deal," the official said, his voice tight with frustration. "But only if you agree to cooperate. We can protect you, we can help you." Marcus took a slow breath, his eyes never leaving the man's face. "You're not offering me protection," he said, his voice hard. "You're offering me silence, and I'm not going back to that. Not now, not ever." The official's jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of the table in front of him. He knew Marcus wasn't going to budge. No one here was going to walk away unscathed. The system they had spent years building, protecting, was crumbling beneath them, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Marcus stood up, straightening his back, his eyes sweeping across the room. "I've done what I came to do," he said, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "And I'll keep doing it until every last one of you answers for what you've done. You can't stop me. You can't stop the truth." He turned, his hand brushing against the door handle. The room was still, frozen in place, as if the entire building itself had stopped breathing. Marcus opened the door and walked out, his footsteps echoing down the hall like the sound of a drumbeat, steady, unrelenting. Outside, the sky had cleared, the gray clouds parting to let through a thin strip of sunlight. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to remind him that there was still hope, still a chance for change, no matter how small. As he stepped into the bright sunlight, Marcus allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. This was just the beginning. The fight was far from over. But it had started, and the world would never be the same again. Thank you for watching this story on Shoe Stories. If it moved you, taught you something, or made you rethink what silence can mean, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments below where you're watching from. Your voice matters. Let it be heard quietly or boldly. And don't go anywhere. Click on one of the videos now appearing on your screen for more powerful stories of dignity, justice, and unexpected. We'll see you in the next.